Welcome to the After the Show social chat. We're going to hope to be doing these after the main broadcast daily. So if you ever wanted to call in, the Skype name is Vincent.Eastwood, and this will be available on YouTube as well as the commercial-free archive section of the Vinny Eastwood Show. Now, continuing on from the show today, we have Andrew Basiago and Bernard Mendez on the line, and we also have two visitors in the chat, Christian and Colston. So we want to open up with some of the chat listeners if they have any questions for these guests. Colston, Christian?
Yeah. Do you mind? Okay. Yeah, what I was saying just before you started recording, Vinny, was to Andrew that, he was saying that, these shows like the Ventura show kind of, at the end, you don't know what's going to be edited out. You don't know what's going to be omitted. You don't know how superficial or how much information. But they did, I think, treat it fairly, as opposed to the way they treated Stuart Swerdlow, I think, at the beginning of the show. And it just sort of, like, you could see it blew Ventura's mind when you showed him the picture and when you guys pulled up to the house. And,
Well, what unfolded there, Christian, is that lady and I had never met each other, and I had described the floor plan of the house. My father and I had stayed there first in the summer of 1973 and then in the summer of 1972 because we had been jumping to New Mexico, the other children and I, in summer of 70. Then I spent my first summer of 71, where I was time looped, living in a rental house in Albuquerque with my dad. And then we progressed on our alpha timeline into fall of 71, and we jumped forward in time to the beginning of the summer of 73, stayed in that rental house at 20 Grand Canyon Avenue there in White Rock, then jumped back to 1971, then progressed through 71-72 school year, my fifth grade year, and then stayed there again in the summer of 72. So what that lady showed is that, over the last 25 years, there was no reason for me to be in her house. I knew the floor plan, which includes the very unique element of a small bedroom to the immediate left of the front door of the house. She said, we've converted it into a computer room. But as I mentioned on the show today, I wasn't able to get into some of the really arcane details that I was able to provide about White Rock, like the name of the realtor who handled the summer sublet, the fact that her husband stated that she had 50% of the summer sublet market in Los Alamos and White Rock during those years, that her name was Deal. That was her married name. That was his name. And he was Bill Deal, the husband of Mary Deal, the woman, the realtor there who had given my father the keys to the house. And he commented, "Oh, that's a great name for a realtor." The fact that I was able to identify two homes...
And they weren't imposters either. This was the real deal.
This was some lady that they knocked on her front door, and Jesse Ventura and a film crew were in her front yard. She didn't know what the hell was going on. And, I had even identified the fact that Marvin Linke had owned that house and a house across town on Kenyatta Circle in White Rock. Now, somebody could say, well, you're a lawyer, you've done mortgages, you know a little bit about real estate filings, but finding out who owned two homes in White Rock, New Mexico, which now only has a population of 2,000 people, 30 years ago, actually 40 years ago, I mean, you can hardly find anything about White Rock or its history even now, even at the public library there. So, I mean, I spent a day there trying to find historical photographs of White Rock just to include in my book. But, and also, if Ventura wasn't moved by my account or didn't believe me, how is it that he and some of the film crew moaned in sympathy when I said I was so homesick living in that house with my dad that I used to fall asleep cycling my legs at night, dreaming that I was running home to New Jersey? Jesse actually moaned. So I wish that had been picked up on film. But no, he's a good guy, and he gave me a good treatment, I think, overall. I just didn't appreciate being characterized as a victim rather than as a victor at the end of the segment. Because as Bernard has commented, I'm on the threshold of silencing my critics, and as to the jump room program, our critics. We've shared so much information that is true, that was jointly experienced, and that can't be made up, that we've essentially prevailed. And that may explain the absence of any federal discreditment besides that hokey thing that they tried, that the Obama administration tried back in January of 2012 involving Wired.com and trying to, put in some chatty dismissal by the president that that he's never been to Mars. So, I think that it's great that Jesse's covering these topics, and I think that involves substantial courage. I think in this season he's knocking down a lot of the most far-out conspiracies, but the problem is, for 10 years I've been giving the people, the places, the technologies, and the events that embody the emergence of time travel in the U.S. defense technical community. I've never been refuted, caught in a system. The only time that anything like that almost happened is when I was being interviewed by Bill Ryan and Kerry Cassidy for their pilot for True TV, which was called Shadow Operations. Kerry was questioning me so quickly and dominating the conversation so much that I made a misstatement about my knowledge of the jump rooms. In fact, we had done a simulation of the jump room in Weed, California in summer of 80 before I was taken to the El Segundo jump room by Courtney Hunt in July of 81. So I misspoke, and I actually caught myself on camera correcting myself that I knew what the jump room was going to look like. It was going to look like an elevator, but I was still startled that it was the elevator in that building. And we hadn't been told that the jump room elevators were literally the elevators in certain defense contractor buildings, in that case Hughes Aircraft. I thought it was going to be in some other location where it was just going to be a standalone jump room, but in fact it was an elevator in that office building that had a dual use. Imagine the UPS guy showing up to bring a package up to the 5th floor, not knowing that if the elevator had taken him to the 8th floor, he could have jumped to Mars. So that was the only time in an interview, print, radio, TV, podcast, that I misspoke in 10 years, and that was, I said, Kerry, I screwed up because you're questioning me so quickly. I misspoke, but and she's famous for that. She has a very combative style of interviewing people. So anyway, what we're talking about is true, and I think it's going to become a hotter story because of Barack Obama apparently is going to be president for the next 4 years. So I'm not going away, and the people are going to be hearing from me about his involvement because it's a matter of historical record.
Well, speaking about hearing from you, we also have another couple of people that have joined the conversation since we came on. We have Ange and Martin as well, so we'll come to you guys in a minute. Colston, did you have a question at all for Andy or Bernard?
I did have a question. Thank you, Vinny. Good evening, all. I had a real deep question, and I've been having conversations with a buddy of mine, Frater X. I don't know if you guys are familiar with him, but we were having a deep conversation about instances of men in black appearing in odd timelines throughout the last, 50 years or so. I can't pinpoint an exact number of years, of men showing up in restaurants and neatly dressed, nonchalant, and waitresses asking them simple questions and them being slightly bewildered. Instances of people, and in a sense, being there but not really supposed to be there. Can you shed any light on that? The men in black theory?
Bernie, do you want to pick that up?
Bernie, are you there?
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It unmutes, but it takes about 10 seconds or 15 seconds to unmute. There's nothing I can do. We're talking about the men in black. You want to a review of that. Is that correct?
Oh yeah. In fact, before you do elucidate on that, Bernie, a friend of mine, Jonathan Eisen from Uncensored Magazine, has encouraged me, very fervently to rewatch the movie Men in Black, because there's apparently a whole lot of hints that get dropped in that film. I don't know if you've seen it, Bernie.
Yeah, I believe there is. That's been going on since I started. I think CIA Director Colby once talked about Hollywood and their movie making and how it's funny that they seem to mimic some of the intelligence community from time to time. So you're not the first one to notice it. And that was back in the 70s when Colby was director of the CIA. So that's quite common. Hollywood and heroism, Hollywood and the military-industrial complex go hand in hand sometimes. Why that is, it's always been that way. But to go back to Men in Black, Men in Black, according to, and I have a encyclopedia about Men in Black, go back quite a ways to the late 1800s or 1900s. More is known now than was known then. It wasn't assumed that, see, you have to take what you knew and when you knew it. The word hybrid beings didn't exist until recent history, past history. So the Men in Black existed, and they weren't assumed to be hybrid beings, although there was a group within this whole Men in Black community that were legitimate government operatives because of their ability to go to a scene or in and around the scene and investigate what was going on in these areas where there was either UFO activity or aliens in the area. This is a very strange phenomenon. It was for like 50 years. There are a lot of opinions about it. The FBI didn't get involved in Men in Black until the 1930s. Now, I haven't read through all the X-Files, but I know they have X-Files with Men in Black. There were mysterious people who appeared and then disappeared in areas. Now, what we suspect now versus what we suspected then are two totally different things. What we suspect now is that they were actual aliens, humanoids like us, who were dressed a certain way, but that their intelligence was, now how can I put this, faulty. The intelligence was based on the past, so they were dressed in a manner as best they could in a colloquial sense to fit in the community, which didn't work out too good because they all dressed alike. And what we suspect now is that they were doing reconnaissance of a kind, that they were in and around a community either looking for something or gathering information and then bringing it back to this location. I'm trying to think of any cases. I think they have some autopsies of these Men in Black. Now, they had no body odor, which was a peculiar thing about them. Their skin was hairless except for the hair on their head. They were never seen in bright or brightly lit areas. So if it was a very hot and sunny day, you wouldn't see them. Or in the rain. And that's another thing they noticed. They weren't where there was rain or where there was water. They appear to have some sort of affinity or some sort of problem or issue with water. In fact,
Yeah.
one guy, go ahead, somebody can say something?
Yeah, I mean, that is accurate to what I have been led to believe as far as these anomalic persons. I mean, but I guess my question is, did they transport? They must have transported into Earth, not, from another. Well, I don't know. Was it a different time continuum? Enlighten me on that subject. Please.
We're not really sure where they came from. we think that they had some sort of network at one time. I think the FBI eventually picked up there was a network of them. And then, because of the military-industrial complex, you have to look at it in parts. The way the intelligence was in the 30s versus the 50s versus the 70s, with intelligence and counterintelligence. So they would have people who would look like them, dress like them, and try to follow them around. But they're very elusive. They're like the Yeti. You know, you see them around, you get close to them, and then disappear again. So that's what was going on. I know they have 1 or 2 bodies, which I saw, an autopsy of one of them. And some of them have no private parts. I didn't read the particular of the autopsy because they didn't completely dissect them. They had a full intact body. As to why they were saving it, I don't know that way, or how recent it was, or what exactly they were doing. There was a TV series called The Invaders, which is a very scary TV series when it came out, which would be more along the line of Men in Black. I don't know if you've ever seen it. You can buy the DVDs or download it from the internet and see 1 or 2 of them. And that's kind of like what this was like. They never was seen in classified areas in the beginning, but as time went on, and this symbiosis and this exchange program began, the Men in Black began showing up. I haven't seen them or heard of them in many years. So
I've heard stories of, this goes back to like 1930 or 26 and 30 in the 50s and the 60s. These, they were men, and they were sharply dressed and inconspicuous, but sharply dressed, impeccably dressed in dark clothing. And there was, I can't verify my sources right now, so, but I'm sure you could. There were instances, and it's just, it's perplexing and kind of scary at the same time, to tell you the truth.
Well, what was scary about it is that this was all part, when I started, of a bigger picture or a part of a puzzle. But everyone was trying to look at it as one puzzle. It was more than one puzzle. There was like 8 or 10, then there was like 12 puzzles. And you're taking pieces of the different puzzles and trying to match them in 12 different puzzles. It's very difficult. But as time went on, and I think the government probably either through part of the negotiations I did, and others obviously negotiated after me on a more intense level than I did, probably brought this question of surveillance to an understanding. And I met with a magistrate, or 2 magistrates, 3 is a quorum, and they will act legally, to explain to them that, and this is where the problem lies, a big part of the problem is that they're viewing our society from a point of view, but that's not what our society is necessarily all about. And the big problem came with them watching the TV and them basing conclusions about our society on the TV. Now, the TV is all fantasy world, and that was a big mistake. That's why there's a lot of disclaimers on TV shows. And they really didn't address this issue until, they didn't really realize this until the 70s, and then address it until in the 1990s, where...
Hey, Bernie, can I stop you for a second?
Yeah. Go ahead.
You seem, you're obviously over-intelligent and going off on a tangent, so can we stop at a point here and back up a bit? And what is the origin of the Men in Black? Let me ask you that. What's the origin?
The proper term is point of origin. We don't know. We assume they came from off-world, and we assume that they were doing some sort of reconnaissance. I haven't seen the interrogation reports, but they didn't seem to talk much. Although I heard people who overheard their conversations, they talk in a gibberish, but they talk very fast. And no one ever quite translated. But they're not of this earth. But there was intelligence, counterintelligence people who dressed like them and was trying to get in with them, or...
Okay, stop right there. So not
Yeah.
of this earth. Not of this earth. Okay, so can you elaborate on that?
Well, if you look at the bodies, and they have no private parts, and they appear to be men, and you were following them around and talking to them, and they're not, and they would answer you in a slow way. So you would say, hello, how are you? And then they would hesitate for a minute, and then answer you in a peculiar way, as if to say, and then, like I say, we know more about linguistics now than we did then. And you know when someone's talking to you, and the way they respond to you, you can tell where they're from, like with an accent. Like somebody would have a southern drawl, or like people down in Australia have a peculiar accent. You would know they're from Australia. But no one could determine by their audio vocalizations where they were from. And that was very disturbing. And that's what I was working on for a short period of time. We couldn't seem to figure out, well, this guy sounds like he's from, like, you know, Australia? No. This guy sounds like he's from South Africa? No. This guy sounds like he's from France? No.
Gotta be Israeli.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Vinny's back.
So,
Vinny, rebuttal?
So that's what was very disturbing when I found out about them. I may have met one of them or two of them, and I don't know if they were in counterintelligence. It was probably some sort of counterintelligence program by that time, because now, and
Well, we
FBI
know
was
that's
probably
rampant.
involved. Yeah.
I'm sorry to cut you off. We know that's... We know that military intelligence, which is an oxymoron in itself, has it, is up to its eyeballs in everybody's affairs, and so, but so, all right, not to beat a dead
Oh, well, hold on, Colston. Let's give somebody else a chance to ask you a question. Martin, or perhaps Ange.
Hi, I'm just sitting here soaking up the information, guys. It's great.
Okay, more of a statement than a question, that.
Yeah. Just to clarify my position on the whole situation.
Okay, that's good.
I've got a question.
You do, Martin. Go right ahead.
How much power in sort of kilowatts would it take to power a jump room?
I don't know. I can say that the teleporter that we were using at Curtis Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey, to jump 2,005 miles to Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm not an electrician. I'm an attorney. But just to analogize, the size of the power cord was about the industrial-sized power cord you would need to power a small industrial device like a lathe or a drill press, which would be about twice the size or presumably capacity of the power cord you would use to power a home vacuum cleaner.
Or an oven.
Or an oven.
Okay, that's right. I have a second question. While you were in the jump rooms, did you see any racks, like server racks with equipment, and did you see anything that looked like a whirligig, which is a Tesla invention?
No, I was going to say that the jump rooms were another technology. We're not sure they were Tesla teleporters, but in fact, as I mentioned on today's show, the origin, structure, and function of the jump rooms was not understood because we're still trying to resolve the paradox that the environment that we visited was presumably Mars, because as Mars neared Earth, the time in the jump room shortened, and that enabled my father to jump one time despite his health limitations. But at the same time, Bernie and I were together on two separate jumps where strange holographic effects were noted that indicated that we weren't interfacing with Mars as biological organisms in a terrestrial domain in the ordinary way. So we're not entirely sure how the jump rooms were working. what they were doing and how they were doing what they were doing in enabling us to interact with Mars in the same way that you would if you flew to Sedona and walked out into the desert, or took your car due east of San Diego into the Anza Borrego Desert. Okay, it was basically taking us to this predominantly desert environment, ostensibly on another planet. Inside the jump room itself, the jump room was indistinguishable from the elevator in a modern office building in any major world city. It had smooth surfaces. When the light panels, however, at the top and bottom of that elevator room began blinking, about 5 minutes into the jump room began morphing from a box-like shape into a cylinder, with literally the ceiling becoming the end of the cylinder. So we had to sort of right ourselves or hang on by holding our hand against the wall, just like when you walk through a water main that's cylindrical. And then it would spend about 10 minutes in that position, and then it would correct itself into a box again, and then about 5 minutes later in those 20-minute jumps, the door would open and we were in one of the jump room facilities on Mars. During the time in the early 1984 period when Mars...
Well, Andy, back up a second. Could you describe what a jump room on Mars looked like?
Well, the jump room that was the elevator in, for example, the West Coast jump room in El Segundo was simply an elevator that had that non-ordinary capability of turning from a box into a cylinder with the concomitant nausea-producing and sort of psychologically deracinating effect of that severe of a ride. Okay, it was much more nauseating than the barrel ride, at the amusement park. At least I found it so. But then when we were at our destination, the jump room opened and we were in a specialized facility that housed the jump room elevator. In other words, the elevator went from housing to housing, and the housing was a conventional office building in El Segundo, California, or in New York City. I once was sent to that one, and I think Bernie might have intervened. I don't know if Bernie remembers that, but I was once sent to the home to the New York jump room, and I was somewhere else. I had to deal with, figuring out where I was, and that was New York City. And I guess I teleported home, but I took the jump room to El Segundo. I don't know. It's been a long time.
And Andrew's talking about, and I did it once because Rummy talked to me, and we were discussing this very issue that he's talking about. And we have issues with the issue itself. The particular jumps from what Andrew was doing from New Jersey out to the west and then back again, and I did that once or twice, was very peculiar. It kind of put you through some sort of time loop where you either arrive early or late, depending on which way you look at it. So, for instance, I know it's like from the East Coast of the United States to the West Coast of the United States, we have a 3 or 4 hour differential. So the West Coast is 3 hours behind us. So if I jump at 7 a.m., I should get there 4 a.m. Okay, so say we have a 3 hour differential between the East and West Coast. And that was the issue with this whole time travel. I wouldn't get there at 3 a.m. I got there at 2 a.m. and sometimes you got there at 4 a.m. So it's plus or minus an hour. But it couldn't be accounted for during the course of the jump. And that was this whole time travel thing, and that's where this whole all the circuit boards lit up. Now, let's say that I jump from the East Coast to the West Coast, and I show up an hour early. That means I have 1 hour to live over again. And if I got information before I left the jump and carried in a canister, and I think Andrew did that a couple of times, to the West Coast, I could conceivably, in the course of an event, predict what was going to happen because I already knew it, because I'm an hour ahead. of everything. And that's what this whole time travel business came in. How far can we push this envelope, one way or the other? Either arriving an hour early or an hour late. As to what the difference was between an hour early and an hour late, I don't think it's either a very big secret or nobody could figure it out. But when you arrive an hour early and you say, okay, in 1 hour, guys, believe it or not, there's going to be an earthquake where you live. So I want you all to hit the siren down there in New Zealand and have all the schools closed, okay? Evacuate everybody and take all the precautions necessary to prepare for the earthquake, which is going to come in about 1 hour. So go ahead and do it. I'm Benny Mendez. I'm sure you believe what I have to say. How's that for a scenario?
Well, that'd be quite funny, actually. We've in fact had people down here in New Zealand who've predicted earthquakes and what have you. And, you know, sure enough, on one of the days that he predicted an earthquake, one really big one did happen and it saved a few people. But what's interesting is that you can come up and tell people this and they'll ask to see your identification or some kind of other verified proof or something. And in the films, when people come in ahead of time, like on Groundhog Day, they simply predict everything that's going to happen just before it happens, and it manages to convince everybody of that.
Mm-hmm. So, where's the proof, as they say? So, in other words, I made a jump at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and it was 3 p.m. in the West Coast. And I arrived, instead of arriving at 3 p.m., I arrived at 2 p.m. So now I have 1 hour of time to live over again. And in that time, I determined that some major event is going to happen. The whole point was to how to deal with this. And that's what we were attempting to do. Now, good.
If I might jump in here, I remember this issue of quantum displacement involving the jump rooms because, Bernie, as you may recall, when we were jumping through as teams, where in the longer jumps, the earlier jumps where we were jumping a greater distance, you could only go with one other chrononaut in the room, in the elevator. You're either going by yourself or one other, but then by 1984 we were going up in groups of 3 and 4 because it was a much shorter time in the jump room and the oxygen was available for a greater number of people. I remember, and Brett has also corroborated this issue of a 15-minute lapse where they were always making sure that when we arrived at the jump room on Mars or wherever we were going, that there was a 15-minute pause before anybody else came through. And I know that had something to do with the quantum displacement issue, but I really can't put it in context. But I do remember that issue existed. So we spent a lot of time around the jump rooms, just sitting around waiting for other people to come through. It wasn't instantaneous. They were staggered in time, just like when you wait around a train station for a train to arrive on schedule, but at a pause of 15, 30 minutes or so. So there's a lot of downtime like that. In fact, my anecdote where I was talking about sitting on the retaining wall and I watched Barry Soetoro, who would become Barack Obama, walking in from the far horizon, and I literally watched him walking in from the terrain back to one of the jump rooms that had kind of 2 chambers to it, and there was a service road between the 2 buildings, and then I was sitting on the retaining wall on one in front of one building. That was occasioned because I was waiting for other team members to come through the jump room, or I was waiting for my opportunity to leave. So there was a quantum displacement issue that was being handled by staggering the arrivals and departures by 15-minute increments. And Brett mentioned that it had something to do with quantum displacement, where we were always coming back 15 minutes before we had left or something like that. So the jump rooms were producing an odd effect like that. And so Bernie's statement, which he just made with no knowledge of what Brett had told me, about the issue of arriving before you had left or before time, where you would have knowledge of world events, that basically inferentially corroborates what Brett had said, that the reason for the 15-minute delays was this quantum displacement in time.
Well, we have never, it has never been fully explained what was transpiring. I don't have an explanation. Good.
There has to be delay. There has to be a delay, Chris, because I mean, with every the basic fundamental, every action there is a reaction, and there must be some flux. All right, there's a flux delay in some regard.
Well, and it's another thing. In terms of flux or whatever, did you have any kind of health effects that are coming out of jumps and things of that nature? I mean, did you feel fluxed up?
The health effects, good.
Well, I'd just like to cover this because I've really investigated this, because one of my purposes in going back and recounting what happened on Project Pegasus and the Jump Room program was to go back and, we were never paid and we were never medically covered either under the GI Bill of Rights, which should have covered us as basically military personnel, nor were we medically insured or monitored. This is what we know. We know that when children or adults were arriving in New Mexico via teleportation back in the 70s, the early 70s, that we were very dehydrated. We know that Donald Rumsfeld mentioned this dehydration and the need to drink a lot of water upon our arrival in his winter-spring 1971 lecture to the group that included myself and about 14 other kids at the Cerrillos Cultural Center site in Cerrillos, New Mexico. We know that when I was briefed by Jack Pruitt, who was one of the team leaders on Project Pegasus, who became the research director of Project Montauk later, that Jack mentioned that dehydration and the energy field in the teleporter, the Tesla teleporter, among the different devices, was believed to be causing the onset in the adults who had been the child teleportees of a disease of metabolic regulation that mimics diabetes. And I've been battling that. You might notice that during some of my radio interviews I've been coughing. I've been coughing basically because I'm chronically dehydrated. I've been diagnosed as having type 2 diabetes, but when I took glucophage, which is metformin, which is the conventional oral medication for type 2 diabetes, what happened is exactly what Jack Pruitt warned me would happen when he warned me not to go on glucophage, which is I became ravenously hungry. I mean, I wanted to just stand in front of the refrigerator and eat. Okay. His son, Glenn Pruitt, has now died. He died about 5 years ago at 700 pounds. Glenn was one of my same age peers who was one of the child teleportees. So we know that if teleportation is going to be introduced for human beings publicly, not just to move freight around the world, we're going to have to solve this issue of the damage it does to human metabolism. Now we also know, and this was embodied in my father's experience, Courtney Hunt confirmed that the adult teleportees back in the old days went on to develop heart valve defects. And I can testify that when my father's chest was opened up in 1978, when he had the first of 2 open heart surgeries to put ultimately 11 segments of blood vessel, another 11 veins in his chest to do a heart bypass, that the distinguished Argentinian surgeon who operated on my father, Dr. Sistatis, who was at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles, asked us whether my father had ever had a heart infection, because when he operated on my father's heart, he found that the valve flaps to the mitral valve of the heart were fused, sort of like the way that the wings are fused onto a butterfly, when they shouldn't have been fused, but been allowed to freely flap back and forth. So my dad, who had teleported extensively in Project Pegasus, spending ultimately 8 cumulative years in quantum displacement in New Mexico, before then teleporting back to the time he left in New Jersey, so that when he died in 1990, chronologically at age 66, biologically he was actually 74, from the elapsed time he spent in quantum displacement in New Mexico. So heart valve defects were one of the things that adults were experiencing, but presumably not the children, because they theorized, Courtney Hunt described, that the the cardiac tissue of adults was more rigid, so that the kind of subatomic vibrational effect of the teleportation was causing basically their tissues in the valves to kind of fuse together.
I mean, we're talking about unprecedented amounts of electromagnetic energy, aren't we?
Yeah, and of course, electrical override, electrocution, accidental electrocution, and radiation have all been actually correlated.
So it's dangerous, isn't it?
Well, we don't know. We don't know what they've done since. I mean, I'm 51, and when I was in those 2 summers, it's going to be hard for me to kind of parse what age I actually was during those 2 summers in White Rock, but, in Los Alamos. But basically, I was roughly 10 years old during those 2 summers where we stayed at the rental house in White Rock, and I learned how to bolt a pill or a vitamin tablet at that time, because my father was giving me some form of medication that was about the size of a small gumball, that you give kids out of the machine. Actually, one of the regular gumball size out of the machine at this grocery store. And I heard my dad whispering to Connie Chavez, we're giving him a big horse pill every morning to try to counteract the effects of the teleportation.
Chris, can I interrupt you for a second? I like what you're saying and stuff, but could you sort of acquaint this group on I don't know, what's your mission statement, and what is your personal true mantra? What do you hope to bring to this group tonight? That's what I'm asking.
Talking to me, Andy, or to Chris?
As a fellow human being, from one person to another.
Who are you addressing?
You.
Okay, I'm Andy. I was on tonight's show.
Oh, Andy? Oh.
Yeah. I'm trying to bring about, I was one of humanity's early chrononauts, and my mission is to inform my fellow human beings that the United States government achieved teleportation-based time travel and several other principal modalities of time-space exploration by 1970 based on different sources, and that while I'm not advocating the disclosure of or the widespread public use of time travel, because that would confuse the causality of timelines in a serious way with many people time traveling, I believe we're going to be needing to declassify and deploy Tesla teleportation simply to move people around the surface of our planet, because automotive transportation is not adequate for that task as we go from 7 billion to 9 billion human beings by 2045.
Right,
so
it's unsustainable. Yeah.
It's not sustainable. So one of the ways we're going to be able to achieve sustainability in the 21st century is to live in a world where, let's say you wanted to fly from London, England to Sydney, Australia. Instead of sitting on a commercial airliner for 24 hours, you could enter a teleport at Heathrow or Gatwick, Stansted in England, and go into a room, sit down in a chair, and that room would basically jump to Sydney in several seconds. Alternatively, you could leap through a teleporter, but I'm not sure that kind of stressful way of teleporting like we were in Project Pegasus is going to be necessary for the public to endure, because we could certainly implement teleportation around the world with a canopy. You'd be inside of basically an airplane-like setting where instead of going conventionally over the Earth, it would go through the kind of vortal tunnels in time-space that DARPA found a way to access, basically to create and to use teleportation by 1970.
I apologize, Andrew. I'm getting I got some static from Christian Wallace. I thought he was talking to me. Some anomaly going on here, but
yes,
I find it.
Well, I see in the.
Are you still there?
Yeah.
Chris, I'm getting like a lot of blue lines, from static on your end. I don't know, whatever, but
All right. Well,
I was confused.
Sit back
I
and
apologize.
well, hold on, Colson. Just sit back and listen for a bit if you're having audio difficulties, or hang up and reconnect.
I do.
Okay, so I've also got another thing to add to this. As I talked about at the very final segment of the show, I've just been editing a few things away in the background here about eyewitness testimony and how it counts as evidence. So let's talk about mass awareness, because this is something that's going to require a lot of leadership, and it's always leadership that moves masses. The masses never move themselves, in my opinion. Like Bernays said, don't convince the masses of what to think. Just convince the doctors and the lawyers, and they'll convince everybody else for you. Is there some kind of a I'm not entirely sure what I'm talking about here. To be honest, I don't know how to convince indoctrinated / educated people of something that they would simply refuse to even look at or entertain. I mean, how do you do that?
Well, Vinny, you do it by doing what I'm doing, which is you talk about it over and over and over again. And let me just go one tick back on the evidential point, because I didn't make this on the show, and I want to underscore this evidential point. There are different forms of direct evidence. So, for example, let's say in a personal injury case or a criminal case, a notation that somebody entered in some kind of regular record-keeping system would come in as an exception to the rule against hearsay, and that might be, oh, that person was on work that night because look, they signed in the logbook. Okay. Now, when you don't have physical evidence of some point that one side or the other is trying to prove, you have two forms of direct evidence that are offered by people talking about what they know. People are able to talk about what they saw and what they did. Now, eyewitness testimony is subject to the vagaries of eyewitness abilities, like maybe the bank robber wasn't wearing a blue sweater, maybe it was a purple sweater. Or maybe it was a red sweater that the eyewitness confused with the next blue sweater they saw after the bank robbery. But the point I want to underscore is when you have two or more witnesses who not only say, we saw this, but who say, we did this together, that is incredibly convincing eyewitness testimony. Because as you made the point last time we spoke, Vinny, that eyewitness testimony includes not only what we see other people do, it includes what we see ourselves and our companions do. Okay, yes, that's direct evidence, but in terms of those forms of direct participant evidence, when you have a participant in the event who saw themselves and others do things, who then are available to testify live and say, I did this with Bernard Mendez, or I did this with Andrew Basiago, or I did this with Bernard Mendez and William B. Stilling, that is virtually considered dispositive of the truth unless it's rebutted in contemporary courtrooms. Because the idea is that the fact that multiple people are willing to testify that they did something with others, that gets over the threshold question of whether one of them is mistaken or perjuring themselves. You know, think about it. When you get three people together to say, you know, we were in the same regiment in France with the U.S. Army during World War II. I remember that Jerome's name was Jerry, and we used to kid him about being one of the Germans, or something like that. That is incredibly convincing testimony, and it overcomes most of the threshold concerns that you have about any eyewitness testifying in a legal manner. So I just wanted to emphasize that means that the blithe assertion by a contemporary physicist that the jump room technology that we're describing isn't technically possible yet, that almost reduces that kind of statement to what the law would consider a nullity, because we have multiple witnesses who not only corroborate the technology, but the experience of the technology in activities that were undertaken together. So anyway, I just wanted to emphasize that point in the law of evidence.
Yeah, well, I think it's also an important point as well, because it's about really convincing the professionals, you know, the people who think that they've got a handle on reality. Those are the people you've really got to convince at the end of the day.
Well, that was in the nature of the treatment I got from the science editor at the Huffington Post when I did that show opposite Dr. Ronald Mallett. I essentially had this snarky science editor who was insisting that what I was saying was science fiction. And, look at it from my perspective. I mean, she thinks I'm talking science fiction because her book learning tells her that time travel hasn't been achieved yet and maybe never will. I'm looking at it from the perspective of somebody who time traveled over 40 years ago as a kid. So what's science? What's knowledge? What is empirical evidence of something? That is the problem. And I think you pointed out a significant part of this problem, and that is that professionals, with all of their book learning and the kind of groupthink that two fields in particular, the fields of law and of medicine, and for that matter, both theoretical and applied science, inculcate people in, causes people in the professional classes, even more than, your journalists in the chattering classes, your political operators, but it's usually the professionals who view themselves as the gatekeepers of reality, based on their claims of expertise and of erudition, of learning. And I'm just sick of it. I mean, what happened to me is exactly what I've described. I've given the names of the people, both famous and obscure, who were in these projects. I've described the technology, the locations. I've been to the locations. I've had participants both admit things when they didn't want to come forward and courageously come forward, as Brett and Bernie have. I mean, game, set, and match. Okay, my truth campaign has succeeded. But we really do have to confront the professions, not so much about the fact that they have something to contribute.
Bernie, we can hear you typing on the computer pad there. Sorry, Andrew, continue.
Right, not that we should.
I'm sorry.
I don't think we should say to the professionals, you're the constraint over tomfoolery that you contribute by being rigid in your adherence to conventional belief is clearly something that is salutary. You want people to resist allegations of new human experience and say, something? I think you're either deluded or lying because I don't believe this is possible. That's a good thing because that kind of causes us to go off the cliff of whimsy and of foolishness when society considers whether something is true or not. I mean, if we didn't have skeptics, then we all might have died already from poisoning during the last, multi-level vitamin craze. Okay, so
I believe that the skeptics didn't have a whole lot of vitamin cravings, really. They were instead drinking Skepto-Bismol.
Yeah, very clever. They are definitely for hunger, but I just think that they have to be told that, look, just because you were told something 30 years ago when you were earning your PhD in physics at Case Western doesn't mean it's the truth. Maybe you were lied to. Maybe the truth wasn't shared with your professor because it was a state secret. Maybe things happened after you got your degree that aren't in the open scientific literature. Maybe something called secrecy exists. Because that's where we're really at. And I'm taking on these people like Dr. Mallett, and of course we have to include in that group in the time travel area, Dr. Kaku.
Whoa. The guy's name is actually Mallett, as in hit you over the head with it?
Right, and they were hitting me over the head with his expertise at the beginning of the show, spending about 5 minutes of airtime lauding his credentials and his contributions to time travel. And I've time traveled. I mean, I didn't invent it, I did it. Okay. But my point here is that it's really a corrosive factor now in legitimate discourse about these topics when we have these house skeptics whose only qualification is their alleged erudition educationally and their skepticism. Because in that way the professions are retarding the truth. I've gotten a lot of toleration from my fellow lawyers here in Washington State, in the U.S., because they're happy that I'm out there disclosing things. They know as lawyers that the government holds secrets, keeps secrets, and that we need to have a truth movement in which secrets will be disclosed. I think they also agree with my surmise that we should use the clear and present danger standard to determine what shouldn't be disclosed by government. Obviously, information that would cause a clear and present danger, like how to build an atomic bomb. But I've gotten a really fair and friendly treatment from my fellow lawyers. But I'm always concerned when I'm placed into an interview or a public appearance with somebody who's literally just alleging, hey, I'm an expert on something and I'm a skeptic. Because such scientists and technicians engage in cognitive dissonance about the truth because they know that secrecy exists and yet they don't want to address the impact of state secrecy on discourse in their field. And that's the dishonest
Well,
practice.
I have a personal story to add here. I once went to a skeptics meeting. My sister invited me. And we were talking about Monsanto and genetically modified organisms and how dangerous they might be. And it was just a whitewash, really, this presentation that this young girl just out of university was giving, that genetic modification's all good and it's perfectly fabulous and nobody dies, nobody gets cancer, nobody gets diseased, and they might take over the entire world's food supply. And I said, well, look, there was an article out that said that Monsanto employees don't get fed GMO food in their cafeteria. You know, why would they do that? And one of this lady's little flipping around with her smartphone, she goes, well, I just had a look for that headline that you're talking about, and it's in websites like beforeitsnews.com and a Drudge Report and da-da-da-da-da. You know, this is a skeptics meeting. And I go, oh right, that's right. You can only trust mainstream media sources because they never lie to you. You know, they don't equally apply their skepticism. They're not skeptics. They're cynics.
Vinny, look at the career of Nikola Tesla. I've heard from many conventional electrical engineers, they'll say something like, oh, well, Tesla was just another electricity or electrical engineering pioneer like Ohms or Watt or Edison. And I say, well, wait a minute. If that's the case, how is it that we find in the open biographical literature, for example, a conventional biography of Nikola Tesla like the one written by Margaret Cheney, that two teams, one consisting of two FBI special agents, and a second team consisting of two officers for the War Department, were racing to his apartment at the Knickerbocker Hotel in Manhattan to seize all of his paperwork upon his death on January 7th of 1943. Would they have done that if that was just the conventional engineering papers of Edison? I mean, Edison's paperwork was rotting until the Edison labs were saved as a National Historical Site by First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton. His papers were rotting. Why then, during the war, did both the War Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation determine that it was of strategic significance that his paperwork be seized? That itself removes Tesla's work from outside the narrow scope of him just being another electrical engineer whose work had already been disclosed and had already informed, for example, the debate over AC versus DC power supply and sort of conventional EE issues of his time. And clearly he was doing work ahead of his time, or there wouldn't have been any strategic significance in pouncing on his paperwork. Like they never pounced on it.
Are you familiar with Victor Schauberger and his implosion technologies?
I've heard the name, and I know that Schauberger is another hidden genius of applied science, but I don't know much about his work.
Right, okay. Well, I'll just explain it in brief. A lot of things that we have nowadays are based on explosions, and he developed systems that worked on implosions, and they're a lot quieter, and they're a lot more powerful, and they're a lot less polluting. And that's basically that. I had another question. Was there anyone on your team that was psychic when you went to Mars?
Well, I certainly was. I had been selected for Project Pegasus because I was clairvoyant. I was able to levitate small, light objects when I was a small child. And I was essentially reading my father and mother and teachers' minds when I was a small child. I would, in fact, go down into our basement in Mars Plains, New Jersey, our cellar, where my dad had a carpentry shop. And he would be sort of fulminating, sort of talking to himself about the events of the week as an engineer for Parsons, and also different issues in his marriage to my mom, and just sort of rummaging through his own unconscious kind of when he was working, but not vocalizing anything. And I would go down and complete his thoughts. Like one time he was angry that only he was working, and my mother had stopped working when they got married in 1955 and then had 5 children by 1961. And I said to my dad, and he hadn't said anything, but I was sitting there on the stoop observing him as he was at his table saw. And I said, Dad, you really shouldn't say that to yourself. Mom doesn't just view you as a meal ticket. She really loves you. She thinks the world of you, Dad. So my dad, as a defense community engineer, knew that I was clairvoyant and was picking up his thoughts. I was also paranoid as a young child, sitting next to somebody who, when I was in physical contact with them, I could also pick up what they were thinking or feeling with total accuracy. And then a couple of times, yeah. So,
when did these psychic abilities actually come of use in the project?
Well, the psychic remote, psychic-based remote viewing was used extensively in Project Pegasus because that's the rudimentary form of time travel. But Project Pegasus, which Bernie and I were on together, the Mars Jump Room program, Bernie and I were on together, the emphasis, the only value of psychic team members like Brett Stillings and I would be whether there was a predator on the other side of a big rock. It was more of an exploration program. I'm sure Bernie has some insight into who among our team members were psychics and so forth.
And what?
You want me to pick this up?
Yeah, I was indicating that maybe you have your own view of it. I don't know. Was psychic ability one of the qualifying characteristics for the Mars project?
They call it precognition, and that's the way it was termed to me. Then the ESP range, they were developing tests as we were along those lines when I started. So everyone was tested for psychic things. I'm trying to recall what kind of testing we had, but ESP goes into another form called precognition. That you're viewing a situation and you're determining what are the possibilities of what would happen and how to react to it. And that's what they were looking for. The astronauts are trained that way. They know, say they land the orbiter on the planet, they get out, they're walking around, they notice this, they notice that, they notice this, and then they make a determination, well, this could happen or that could happen, and we'll do this and that, and then actually that's what happens. And it's difficult to explain. It's a lot of scenarios that you have to be trained on. But basically it's precognition. It's generals are like that. Certain battlefield commanders were like that. They knew that the Germans were going to attack this area a particular way, so they set up a defense and ambushed them. That's precognition. So people can have precognition about a lot of things. You can tell when a phone's going to ring or someone's going to call you. That happens in our daily lives from time to time. But it was like trying to focus this precognitive ability on situations that you would encounter in the unknown or the jump room. And that's what they were looking for as part of an attribute to get into this program. And if you demonstrated that ability, I'm very interested in you. Go ahead.
Well, thanks a lot. That really answers my question. Just one last question. The artifacts that you saw on Mars, have you got any sort of sketches of like shapes and markings and that kind of thing?
Of what? What was there?
The artifacts. You said earlier there was a little boy and he was jumping up and down on an artifact. Have you got any pictures or sketches that you've done of these places?
We took cameras. There were pictures. The place was under surveillance sometimes. We'd set up a camera at a distance, and then it would roll a time-lapse photography sort of thing. Some of it would only be activated when you arrived. You would activate the camera. A lot of it was classified. Still is. The initial job, you see, you're looking at things and you're trying to give one big broad explanation for it all. There was no broad explanation. We did it in increments. The first jump to an area, if it was a new area, we go out, spend maybe 30 seconds, 15 seconds out there, look around. Then we come back, we say, well, it's a desert area with some rocks, there's a hill on the horizon, or there's trees and flowers, and or we saw some creatures moving around. So then the next jump, until you have 4 or 5 jumps that would say that it's all very similar reports of observances, or what they call observed reports. And then after that, a determination would be made if the jump room was available, because sometimes it would go down. You could get 3, 4, maybe 5 times out of it, and then it would go down. And then the next set of jumps, they would determine whether they want to send them recon teams, or they want to take samples, or they want to go a little further forays, further out, away from the jump room. Was the atmospheric conditions conducive to human habitation? There's enough oxygen out there so you can go a couple of miles, jog off a couple of miles, and then come back. Or does the camera work? Does the flashlight work? There were some simple tests we did right away to determine what. So the next jump would do something else. This is all like leapfrogging. This is all about the next group. It really wasn't about what you were doing. You had a mission to do. Take samples, soil samples, rock samples, pictures, films, videos, and then always be very alert for something moving around. We'd always be looking. Sometimes you'd stand back to back. As trees, you'd stand back to each other and walk around in a circle, so that each of us would get a 360 view of everything. And then we all agree and say, I see a rock, I see a tree, I see a creature, I see a rock, I see. You'd be spinning around in a circle back to back until everyone agreed as to what they were seeing. And that the jump that Andrew was talking about with this boy happened. And this happened 3, 4, 5 times. I was privy to 3 jumps. The exact same thing happened over again. Brett saw a friend from high school. Somebody said it looked like my brother. Somebody saw somebody else. Whoever it was, I'm pretty sure it was a gray in a costume, fooling us somehow. Whatever the case may be, we all saw something different. So on these jumps, we did in increments. We were all very careful to do it in increments so that each jump, we would all come back and report, and we'd give out observations or observed report, and they would all match until we got enough matches that we go to the next level, go back there and take samples, go back there and go over the horizon. The oxygen looked good. See anything strange on the horizon? What did the sky look like? You know what I'm saying? What was the lighting like? So
were there any birds?
Yeah. I've never seen any birds, though there was some reports of pterodactyl or some other peculiar bird. There's some pictures of some of them. I think actually Barry may have taken some of those pictures of the pterodactyl, the flying bird, flying around and going after some peculiar worm-like creature that was floating around the air.
It must
He
have
may
been.
actually done that.
It must have been what inspired him to marry Michelle Obama. Not that I'm calling her a
I was there
pterodactyl.
right after I was there right after they first met. So I met her once. I think she would remember me because we had a very long conversation. So, but that's the way we did it. That's the way I approached it. I was never pushing it. I never would stay longer than the next day. That's another reason why I left the program. When the Navy people came in, they were saying, well, I'm going to break the record. And there was no record to break. You know what I'm saying? They didn't want a person with a mindset that's going to sit there and go, I'm going to stay out longer than you did, or I'm going to go further than you did, or I'm going to take more pictures than you did. You had a mission, and that's what you did. You did it well, and came back in one piece. And if you approached it that way, you made progress, and you came back safe and sound. And that's the way I always looked at it. Does that answer your question?
We have another question from Ange as well. Sorry.
Yeah.
What is she saying? Barry Satoro, what was his purpose in the project and to what end? Do you believe he was made to be president?
I'd like to take that one.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Barry Satoro, who has been positively identified as Barack Obama by the 3 of us, and the fact that his biological mother, Stanley Ann Dunham, or the woman posing as his biological mom, was also auditing the summer 1980 jump room training program at College of the Siskiyous, as was my father, Brett Stilling's father, and occasionally the mother of Regina Dugan.
When you say auditing, what kind of auditing are we talking about? Are we talking about inventory, financial records?
No, that's a term that's used in the States. I'm not sure it has currency throughout the rest of the Anglophone world. Basically, what I mean by that is that the course was being taught to the young people who made up the future jumpers, which was the 10 teenagers plus Bernie as a federal investigator who was being dropped into the program. The parents were not expected to be jumping, and by auditing I simply mean that they were invited to attend and listen, but they weren't the individuals being educated via the course. They were just listeners or people who were being briefed as
the classroom equivalent would be a second teacher that just kind of sitting in the background like a trainee or something like that. Not learning, but just an observer.
Yeah, they were invited to observe and listen, and also maybe, I don't know what other functions they had been tasked. They might have been tasked to monitor the emotional response of their children or to provide adult opinions regarding the responses of some of the kids in the program. We really don't know what they had been tasked to do prior to sitting in on those classes. We do know that my father and Brett's father stopped at the McLeod Market in McLeod, California, which is off of exit 745, which is 2 exits south on the I-5 from the road that'll take you from I-5 right to the college. And that both of them came out of that market with a substantial growth of beard. So clearly my dad and Brett's dad had been time looped in some way, and there may have been some pre-lecture or pre-seminar that they had attended prior to sitting in on what we then experienced, in real time. So Barry was just another college kid who was being trained with that group, and I think it's fair to say, he and I are literally same age peers. Barack Obama is 45 days older than me, having been born on August 4th of 1961, if we're to believe his birth date, and I was born on September 18th of 1961. And I think it's fair to say that the median average of the kids was probably around our birth date, because there were a few individuals who were a few months or a year or so older. And Willie McCool was born on September 23rd of 1961. So 3 of the males were very close in time in terms of time of birth, or date of birth. And I think it's also significant that Barry and I ended up essentially being given a mission on Mars. We were leaving the jump room and going somewhere and doing something. I don't know what he was doing, but what I was doing, and let me wrap this into the question that Christian posed about the involvement of RAND Corporation, Santa Monica, California. I was leaving the UCLA campus during the time I was jumping from summer of 81 to the spring of 84. When I was in college during the school year, I was leaving the UCLA campus in Westwood, California, driving over to West Los Angeles, California, where there was a subsidiary of the RAND Corporation of Santa Monica that was preparing data for the U.S. presence on Mars. And it was placed on one of those 3.5-inch rigid computer disks that we ended up calling a floppy, because the original 5.25-inch disks were pliable, because we were still calling it a floppy disk. Well, when they came out in the early 90s, that rigid plastic 3.5-inch disc, I was taking that kind of disc about 10 years before they emerged commercially. From that subsidiary or contracting company that was under the RAND Corporation, but not RAND of Santa Monica per se, I was jumping up to the jump room facility on Mars that we called the Corkscrew, walking about 3/4 of a mile straight out and to the right, into a dilapidated brick city or neighborhood. And one of our American colleagues had established a telecom location in one of those gutted buildings. I don't know if Bernie remembers that guy, but he basically was sitting at a table with about 8 different computer-like devices on it. And so it was my mission. I was tasked ultimately to make a set of jumps to refurbish that position with data that wasn't being sent telemetrically through space, but was being physically delivered via a magnetic recording device, basically that floppy disk, to that individual. And I think it's safe to say that Barry was engaged in some other fixed mission once we had our initial jumps. What I can't really put together in time is whether the jumps that Barry and I did with Bernie, like where we were testing the environment, came before or after we were fulfilling that mission. I think that those jumps with Bernie came after we were fulfilling that rather rote mission. So President Obama was not only in our training class and jumped with us, but he was risking his life by leaving the jump room environment, the immediate jump room environment, and going out into the Martian terrain at risk of being eaten to perform some kind of function, because at least once I saw him coming in by himself from the far distance. So I'm gonna presuppose, I'm gonna guess that that was not just him wandering around away from the jump room, but he was fulfilling his permanent assignment after we had been tasked with a permanent mission. And I received that mission, by the way, in an underground briefing room. It was one floor below the main floor of that building in El Segundo, California, where the jump room was. And the person who gave me that assignment was not Bernie, but it was Major Ed Dames. So some of us had permanent assignments that we then did. I did about 20 jumps with those data disks to get that data to the telecommunications center that particular team member had established in that dilapidated brick city. Who built the city? Was it us? Was it one of the Martian humanoids? I would see the Martians, some peeking out from windows. Their children were very cute, little Cupid dolls in their small
hold on a second, Bernie, you're making a lot of noise moving around back there. We can't hear what Andy's saying.
Yeah,
Very good.
I forget the Arab word for kaftan, right? Kaftan. The Martians, who are more diminutive than us and have narrower heads and pointier ears and longer, pointier fingers, and a distinctively kind of frightened, recondite personality, where they're very wary of Earthlings. They like to look at you from behind a barrier, like a building, a wall. Look at you kind of furtively through a gutted window. This type of thing, or from behind a rock.
Like they're on safari.
I think.
They enjoy you and they're taking pictures of you, but they see you as kind of like a lion. Is that sort of behaviour? They're very interested and they know that you probably won't hurt them, but they're still a little bit cautious.
Well, I think the way that falls together anthropologically is that they were the original Martians in terms of the evolution of a humanoid typology on Mars before the Earthling typology of Homo sapiens went there and then had progeny who are still there. And we know that what I call the Earthling descended Martians, I call them Homo maris terris, or basically men of Mars from Earth. And I call the more diminutive sort of traditional Martian-looking beings that look more like Homo sapiens who are children who have progeria, that aging disease. In other words, they have narrower heads, slightly larger crania though around the forehead, but then pointier ears and fingers and so forth. I think that they're wary of Earthlings because they were basically colonized by Earth already in antiquity, prior to the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, that basically ended civilization on Earth until it was restarted around 3000 BC in ancient Sumer, and that clearly devastated Mars so that the Martian civilization went underground. There's also a gray ET variant of humanoid on Mars that probably was left back there as either gray ETs bereft of spaceships, or as a hybrid between one of the two races and the gray ETs, who we know helped kickstart human civilization on Earth after that solar system catastrophe. In other words, in 3000 to 4000 BC in ancient Sumer. Actually, 4000 to 3000 BC in ancient Sumer. So I think the Martians, the Martians, the Homo maris, as I call them, are legitimately wary of us because we colonized them in antiquity. What we were told is that they were very ethical except when they decided to supplement their diet by eating one of us. So that we should be generally wary and avoid befriending them or being in a confined location with them, because when that had happened, some of our personnel had been jumped and killed by them and eaten. I don't know whether they were cooked, but so we lost some of our people basically to cannibalism, or at least another form of predation with the Martians. The Martian humanoids are allies of ours. My father and I encountered 3 of them at Curtiss Wright in the summer of '70. They had more advanced flight technology at that time. And whether or not the Martian humanoid civilization embodied in our relatives on Mars was a danger to human life on Earth, human civilization on Earth or not, was the focus of a threat assessment that I and Barry Obama and Regina Dugan each individually authored during that summer of 1980 when we were at College of the Siskiyous. We were asked to read through a stack, about a 4-inch stack of briefing documents and draft our thesis of whether or not we believed that the Martian humanoid civilization presented a threat to human life on Earth. So Barry's functions pretty much tracked my own. I mean, he was trained with us. He was doing acclimation trips and then exploratory trips, like when we were interacting with Bernie as an investigator on the surface, and then these sort of static missions where we were being used as errands to bring data to different outposts on the surface.
Hello.
Yes.
I'd like to comment on this Martian thing. The reports I read, and I met one of them and talked with one of them, there's no proof of the cannibalism, although it was suspected. There were no bodies recovered that were autopsied. They could have actually fooled us, which was one report, that they captured some of us for whatever purpose they had, I assume for mating, and that we are them. They are our ancestors. That's what we look like, or an offshoot of the human race eons ago, where they don't have as good prenatal care as we do. So they don't get as much nourishment as we do. So we became bigger, stronger, heavier, more agile than they did. Well, they're quite agile. And they're on the more thinner, leaner side because they don't need as much as we do. Not that they need nourishment. Apparently, never really understood exactly how they're being nourished. We assume the gray creatures are maintaining them. So overall, and eventually when we made contact, I spoke to one of them face to face, and it was very peculiar talking to him. He didn't seem to know English quite well. He talked a very strange mannerisms in a very strange way. But eventually I got through. They knew a word. I want to speak to your leader. I'm a leader. I need to speak to your leader. My leader wants to speak to your leader. And eventually I got through to the leader right after Andrew had the threat assessment. I read some of the reports, but I read actually summarizations of things. And what the leader said, in essence, was that he was sorry for the misunderstanding of this cannibalism thing that people were there. Apparently, they don't have the right to mate. They don't have females, or females are rare. And they don't have the right to actually move around like we do. They're segregated and they're isolated. And we entered their space, according to the gray creatures. We shouldn't have done that. And the gray creatures were negligent. They shouldn't allow us to have contact with them. So we entered their space and they detected us and they made contact with us. The gray creatures should have prevented that. They never should have allowed us to have contact with them. Having knowledge is not a free thing out there, like we have knowledge here with libraries and institutions that we have, great institutions that we have. So the whole threat assessment changed after that. They were considered not a threat, that we had a communication barrier, and that we shouldn't have had contact with one another. And whether or not we are descendants of them and they're a parallel or an offshoot of the human race, which is probably true. I mean, if you look at them, they had very peculiar hands. I think one of them actually came to this planet. I think that was part of the exchange program, for him to come here and try and explain himself to us. Or he was captured and brought here. I don't know which. I thought I saw one at the areas, but I wasn't sure.
Well, you're saying that they're part of some kind of exchange program, like in high school?
Well, that was the whole plan. The big plan was to make contact and to have an exchange program so that they come here, we go there, we show them around, they show us around, kind of thing. They tell us stories, we tell them stories, and then begin exchanging goods and services, whatever, and to get to know one another, kind of thing. And that's what ultimately was going to happen. But the gray creatures intervened and said that we shouldn't have contact with them and that they shouldn't have knowledge of us, that it wasn't a good idea. They were a bit on the savage side. They really can't, like, we can go to their environment. They didn't really want us to go in their environment. We only saw them on the surface. I assumed that they lived underground. I didn't see any buildings that they lived in, but I didn't look around. I didn't really want to approach them when I was there. I didn't want to go near them. I kept my distance, and I told them, do not touch me. Do not come any closer. I put my hands in a certain fashion, hand signals, that they were being warned not to approach. But I was even armed one time, because more of them showed up, and I really didn't like the looks of them, and they showed up very rapidly. So eventually, this matter was ironed out that we shouldn't have contact with one another. The gray creatures have a word called contamination, and it's a very peculiar word. It covers a lot of things. It's kind of like saying, if I go to a biologically hazard area, I'll get contaminated. They look at everything that way. So if I go to this area where those humanoid Martians look like, I contaminate them, and then they're disturbed. So when they all showed up, I was disturbing them. They were all someplace, probably underground or in the hollow earth or whatever, and they were there, and they were doing whatever they do. We don't know what their lifestyle is like. And I disturbed them by going there, and I shouldn't have done that. And then when they all came moving around, started coming up wherever they were coming from, it set off a bunch of tripwires and a bunch of alarms, and that's when negotiations opened with the gray creatures. They were maintaining them for some reason. Now, what the reasoning was, we don't know for sure. I assume that what's left of the actual population that lived there, either indigenous Martians or a group that was there, that got caught up in their Holocaust or whatever catastrophe befell the planet, and they have them there in stasis, and they have them doing have a very Spartan, menial life, and that our presence there disturbed them because now they became aware of the fact that there's other beings and there's other worlds, and they may want to have this like in their mind that they need to go out and move around and do things, and you don't want them doing that. Now you can call that being held hostage, if you like, or you can call that holding their civilization in some kind of stasis to preserve them until they repair Mars or build a civilization where they can live like us or like other beings and lead a productive life. That's probably what's going on. That's an educated guess based on the available intelligence at the time. And you're talking a very long time ago. I don't know where it is now. But whatever the case, they were segregated. The gray creatures didn't want us having contact with them. And they didn't think it was a good idea to go near them because they would look at us and then they start freaking out like we would freak out when we see aliens and would cause a disturbance. They get very agitated. And that's what led up to these conflicts. Go ahead.
Bernie, if I might pick up on what you were saying about the different typologies, I just want to kind of nuance what we know about the different typologies, because I agree basically with everything that you said in terms of our encounters with the different humanoid typologies on Mars, but also on Earth. And that is that the first typology, the ones that I call Homo maris terra, relatively more crude-looking Caucasians than the nth European or Caucasian-descended human being on Earth, presumably because they have a more narrow gene pool. There are only about 1 million humanoids in the underground civilization, according to the CIA. According to the CIA official who called me at 4 days
That has
after.
never been confirmed. That has never been proved. But go ahead.
What hasn't been proved?
That there's only 1 million of them.
Oh, okay, right. I was called by a career CIA officer 4 days after I published my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, in 2008, and I'm just using that as a data point for the fact that it's a numerous population under the surface, but it can't be 1 billion, and it can't be hundreds of million, because Mars is only 40% the volume of Earth, and it was impacted by that relatively recent solar system catastrophe, more recent than Earth. I mean, more severely and occurred at the same time that Earth was impacted, and there's hardly any vegetation on Mars. So we have to presume that that population is dramatically smaller than the human population on Earth. But what I just wanted to distinguish the typologies. The first typology, basically, in my lectures, I basically describe them as bald, ugly white guys. They basically look like relatively unhandsome actors, like, let's say, Telly Savalas. I don't know if that's a name that everybody would recognize, but someone like who served as, or played Uncle Fester in the Addams Family. Yet if they were dressed in an Armani suit and were walking down a street in any major city in the world, they would not get any attention because they would simply look like well-dressed, bald guys who aren't particularly handsome. I don't remember ever meeting a female of that first typology or seeing a female of the first typology. Now, those Martians, when you talk about the humanoids on Mars, those Martians were the ones that my dad and I encountered in summer of '70 at Curtis Wright, New Jersey. And those were the Martians that Brett Stillings has claimed were coming through the jump room at El Segundo. And he was even tasked to go out to local department stores and find them footwear. Okay, now the second type were the ones that I saw. I've never saw them on Earth, and I don't think they were coming to Earth via jump room. That smaller typology that looked more elfin and more sort of culturally distinctively Martian, those were the ones that I saw when I was walking through the dilapidated brick city, them wearing black caftans as their cute little children were too. And I want to just emphasize that I wasn't alleging that they had cannibalized us. That was just something that I was told in my training that caused me to be very wary of them, kind of like when I would pass by them. I would be wary in the way that you would be if you were walking past some property where there was a vicious dog or something. You're just trying to avoid an altercation. But I don't have any direct evidence that they had ever killed any of our personnel or that they were cannibals. But I had been warned to be wary of them. Now, that type maybe has come to Earth, but I don't think they possess the flight technology to do so, because I believe that they're relatively at an indigenous level of development, and I think that their culture was overwhelmed by Earthlings. But I do think it's clear that the world-spanning media industry, the entertainment industry and mainstream media, is being used to acquaint Earthlings with that typology of humanoid, because that typology appears over and over again in mainstream media. You'll have like a record album cover where this keenly blue-eyed, bald, elfin-like human is shown. So that may be because if both the Earthling descended and the Martian descended Martians want to come here and leave Mars and enjoy the convivial conditions that exist on planet Earth, the first typology, the ones that are descended from our ancestors who journeyed to Mars before the solar system catastrophe, could readily be dropped into contemporary civilization without any alarm. But the more elfin Martians would clearly be viewed as different in kind by contemporary Earthlings. So I think there's been an attempt in mainstream media to condition the human population on Earth for that second typology of Martians who seem more extraterrestrial, more elfin, more leprechaun-like than contemporary Homo sapiens. And I agree with Bernie that that natural selection has favored the characteristics that would be able to cope with a restricted environment, restricted nutrition, and so forth. I mean, Mars is a desperate place to live compared to Earth. And then the third type...
That's the whole issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, they're the survivors of natural selection on a planet where you might not eat for 3 weeks, where there's hardly any agriculture, where there's a musculature that is consistent with them digging their ancestors digging their way out of the solar system catastrophe.
That's a big issue. That's why the threat assessment was made, and that's why I recommended that we stay away from them, that we isolate ourselves from them, because they don't have anything. We have plentiful here. If they find a way to jump here and let's say there is millions of them, and they all jump at once, they'll ever wreak havoc in our world. Now, at the time, I had requested that a study be done to determine if there was any types of autopsies in the past or any types of sightings of these Martians or these other I call them humanoids, the three different types, however you want to classify them. And apparently there may have been. They're unconfirmed reports. So they've been here before. And the point is, and Andrew said, they have a desperate world that they live in. We don't have a desperate world we live in. If they find out about our world, and this is what the great creatures are talking about, like a contamination, they may somehow, and don't say it's impossible, somehow figure a way to get here, infiltrate our society, and do serious damage. And we could do serious damage in either way to their society by being there and contaminating us with our diseases, having contact with them, either sexual or whatever, and causing havoc in their world. So my threat assessment, which I think Andrew was privy to some of it, and then later on I got called in to the Pentagon for a briefing and gave a threat assessment, was that stay isolated from that. And I think that's what's ultimately going to happen. We're going to isolate ourselves from all these things because simply the fact that we have a society at one level, even though they're technologically advanced at one level, they're desperate for things at another level, which we're not desperate for, but we're not desperate for the technology either. But, we have a very serious situation potentially. And the best thing to do until we can further, our civilization can cope with all these different concepts of civilization itself and what we are and what they are, is to isolate ourselves from them and stay the hell away from them. And let's not get into let's try to avoid situations where this could escalate into something. You try to assess them that we give.
Bernie, if I may, it's the same perspective that I'm sure a lot of Native American chiefs said about the Pilgrims. Just stay away from them.
That's it.
Well, I think it's a complex.
We don't want to.
Yeah, I think it's a complex formulation. I know that by 1970, the U.S. aerospace community, air technical community, was collaborating with the Martian humanoids. I think that given the personality of the Martian humanoids, so in other words, by 1970, the U.S. aerospace community was interacting with the Martians that are the descendants of our ancestors who went to Mars, had progeny, and that ended up surviving the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC. The second group, I don't think, could ever be integrated into contemporary human civilization simply because their appearance and their behavior is too strange. You could make as many movies like Star Wars where you're showing bar scenes with different creatures sitting around, on a social level. But the bottom line is that the behavior of the Homo maris typology was so strange that they would have to be isolated physically on Earth if they were brought here. Now, the remote viewing team of Dr. Courtney Brown, not to be confused with Courtney Hunt, our fellow jumper, but Courtney Brown, found that, quote-unquote, some of the Martians have already come to Earth, and they've been settled in the mountains east of Santa Fe, or east of Santa Fe, and in locations in South and Central America. I don't know whether that's true, but we really have 3 data points. We have my encounter in 1970 in New Jersey, and that was the Homo maris terris typology. Brett interacting with the same typology. In fact, Brett Stillings claims that a fairly prominent American television actor is in fact a Martian. And he knows this, and his family knew this individual as one of the Martians who came through the jump room in El Segundo. But then we have the third group, and I would say that relative to Bernie's comments about the issue of contamination, I only encountered the Homo maris extraterrestrialis typology, the ones that clearly have some admixture of genetic descent from the gray extraterrestrials, on Mars, like the one that was up on the top of the jump room when one time in 1982 when Courtney Hunt and Brett Stillings and I exited the jump room and infrastructure, the building, and I cried out that there was a gray up on the roof observing us. There was no interface with that group, and they seemed to actively be avoiding contact with us. And if you look at the negligent way that the program was handling the issue of contamination, it seems like as possibly the most intelligent humanoid species on Mars, the ones who had some gray ancestry were clearly avoiding us, presumably to avoid the viruses and bacteria that we were bringing with us from Earth. And then that's consistent with Bernie's statement about how in his interactions with literally, off-planet gray extraterrestrials, the issue of contamination by pathogens from Earth was very much in the minds of the gray extraterrestrials.
That's a big issue with them. And that's why I recommend that we be isolated from them and stay away from them. We don't know where this is going to lead. Now, there was a group of people, it was like 3-4 groups. There was a group of people saying that if everything's evil, they're evil, whatever. And there's another group of people that wanted to go ahead and boldly go there. But there's a group like me, and that's the group I sided with, is that we should proceed with extreme caution. We should not embrace the unknown, because it's unknown. We don't know what's liable to happen. How do you assess the unknown? And how do you assess interchanging with this culture that appears to be savage in ways, allegations of cannibalism? We can't, we can bring them here and show them everything, but they couldn't seem to bring us there and show us everything. Now that's a threat, and that's an unknown. And even if they're there just standing around like the rest of the civilization is doing nothing all day, and just being held in stasis until they rebuild the civilization, they become a viable, thriving population again, thriving civilization again. That's not really our affair. But the great creatures were talking along those lines. So maybe we should leave them alone and stay away from them, rather than assume a condition where we give them some kind of disease, or they give us some kind of disease, or they come here and wreak havoc, or
I relate this to that.
Why do all this? Avoid it.
See, I relate this to the Hadron Collider. What could you possibly discover? Oh, well, we could discover the origin of man and the God particle. Okay, and what could be the possible negative consequences? Well, we might create a black hole and destroy the entire Earth. Bro, it's not worth the risk.
It's the whole point. What practical purpose does it serve in our lives right now? It doesn't.
I mean, curiosity.
There's no practical application.
Look at this, Bernie. Curiosity killed the cat, but humans ain't got 9 lives. We make one massive mistake, and it could threaten the existence of everybody. I mean, is that what threat assessment is really about? Weighing up the risk versus the potential benefits. And if the potential benefits are lacking or not certain, and the risk is possibly very grave, it's just simply good mathematics to just not do it.
Actually, Vinny, the potential threat to these provocative technical shots in the dark, like the Hadron Super Collider project, the threats are worse than you described, the potential threats. So, for example, what would be worse than destroying Earth or the solar system or the galaxy with such a project would be if we did something like accidentally inserted Earth in the event horizon of a black hole. Certainly the people who were experiencing a toothache during that event would not thank us. In other words, if we simply froze everything that was happening at a given moment by creating a quantum effect of some kind of stasis, but stasis where we were still sentient, we could create basically a hellish outcome for some members of civilization. I'm sure that people dining on their favorite dinner or engaged in sexual activity where they were experiencing pleasure would not find it hellish to be stuck in a pleasurable event. But imagine if you were stuck for all time or for a cosmically unbelievably long period of time in some moment of pain or extremeness. So in fact, by engaging in these very advanced applications in quantum physics with no real understanding of the quantum side effects, our technical community is actually putting our civilization at risk of literally a science fiction outcome that none of us would welcome.
I've also
That's the whole point.
Speaking of which, speaking of science fiction, I was just thinking about this the other day. How many positive science fiction movies are there where stuff has actually gotten better? I don't think I've seen one. In every single science fiction scenario, it's a bad future. Either everybody's become domesticated, or most people are dead and the survivors are picking through ash and scrap for something to eat. There's no positive outcomes in the future sci-fi movie industry I've seen. You know, couldn't we have a positive science fiction movie for a change? Something that we could be heading towards? What would be your science fiction fantasy?
If this is all leading someplace,
Vinny.
and the place it's leading is ugly. It's ugly out there.
I was just talking to a lady today called Infinitas I've got on Skype, and she was talking about visualizing the world that you want to see of tomorrow. So that's a project that I'm going to be working on, just constantly visualizing how I want the world to appear.
No, but instead of visualizing it, imagine making a movie about it. Like not a documentary, but a real live action movie. But what would be the protagonist? You know, what would be the storyline that people could really get along with in a positive future? There's no challenges to overcome in a positive future, are there?
Right,
There's
actually
always
the
a
formula
challenge.
for feature film. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Andy.
Well, the formula for feature films, I'm sure that some of our guests today have probably heard of it. It's basically character, conflict, and change. And in fact, you can utilize a number of conventional feature film formats. You know, the war movie format, like Saving Private Ryan, or the trial format, like To Kill a Mockingbird, and the other types of the thriller novel, like let's say the Pelican Brief type movie where there's a whodunit going on. You can use those conventional formats as long as you have character, conflict, and change. You could make an entertaining movie where the outcome would be utopian. The reason that they use negative emotions is that people respond more innately in rapt attention to negative conflicts because it's life-threatening. So they're evoking basically the primary, wiring of a human being. Is this protagonist going to be killed or not? Versus, is this protagonist going to help humanity achieve utopia or not?
Maybe a combination of the two. Maybe you're in a positive future where teleportation's a reality. Nobody got any trouble about getting around. We go to Mars on holiday or something like that, go on safari, shoot a few dinosaurs. And on the other hand, there's also some really, really deep, fragile research going on all over the planet by all these people that have had the Department of Patents essentially disbanded, and the works of Tesla now becoming public knowledge, and all of these technologies that have been developed, which are now in everyday use. And now people are experimenting with other things that are perhaps a little bit more strange. Really, really odd things. Even stranger than time travel, like being able to shapeshift, for example. Somebody creating a technology where you could sit in a machine and you could literally morph through the device into another form, and it could be a much larger form. Like you could transform yourself into, say, the size of an elephant, like a transmorphing help honey I shrunk the kids type device. And there's a certain risk involved with going into those kind of experiments. Accidents happen, that sort of thing. I would think if there was any positive future where most things are all solved, and now people are just kind of, how a really intelligent person who's in class gets really bored very quickly because the work is too easy for them, and they start tinkering around and causing trouble just for the hell of it and causing harm to themselves and their teams. That kind of movie.
Yeah, Vinny, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't address the fact, and I think it's germane to the whole Mars cover, time travel cover-up, that in the post-war era, science fiction evolved as a literary genre as a form of disinformation for the Allied or post-war political and military order that had been engaged in advanced defense technical work during the war and later. So let me give some of the hallmarks of that cover-up. Were you aware of the fact that Arthur C. Clarke and Robert Heinlein had desks next to each other at British intelligence during the war?
No idea.
Were you aware? No. And Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time was identified by my father as disinformation. The first time I heard the word disinformation was when my father explained that the book A Wrinkle in Time, which uses CW for Charles Wallace rather than the protagonist, is a reference to Kurt.
Bernie, you're scratching around back there. You're kind of causing a bit of noise.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and mute my mic, but when I do it, it takes about 5 minutes to do either way. But go ahead.
That's okay, man. Sorry, go ahead.
So Madeleine L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time utilized CW to conceal Curtis Wright. There's a device in the book called a tesseract, which is literally a literary contraction of what...
Did you say tesseract? Because there's been a couple of Marvel movies called Captain America: The First Avenger, where these Nazis who've been deeping into the occult and everything, they find this artifact called the Tesseract, and they use it to charge and power their new weapons technology. And it's later used in a sequel to the film as a portal, a gateway to open a wormhole through space-time, whereby they can send an army through that gateway.
Well, that is what a tesseract was. Basically, in the when Tesla's teleportation technology was reduced to shop manuals that, as Bernie knows, if somebody tried to remove those from a secured location, they would be shot in the back, literally, by trying to remove sensitive material like that. The Tesseract was a Tesla energetic array. It's a contraction of what the Tesla teleporter was identified as in pictures of it in some of these Department of Defense shop manuals, or kind of like hardware directories, as a Tesla energetic array. We have the example of Marvel Comics doing a sidebar to the Avengers series of comics purporting an alternate Project Pegasus as some kind of advanced space project underground in New Mexico. Okay, so science fiction has been used certainly to entertain and to inspire bright young minds to conceptualize a more advanced human future. That's been the positive capability. But the negative capabilities, it's been used by the permanent secret.
Oh, sorry. Bernie, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
I think that was crosstalk. But it's used by the permanent secret government to conceal what areas of science have been applied technically and what's been achieved, and information about particular applications. So, for example, when teleportation emerged on Star Trek, initially debuting on American television in 1966, that was at the time that Tesla teleportation, based on an opposite technology, one that opens up vortal tunnels rather than that dematerializes the teleportee, had actually emerged in the U.S. Defense Technical Community. Of course, another example being Irwin Allen's TV show, The Time Tunnel, which purports a concrete time tunnel rather than a superluminal one, rather than a hologram-based vortal tunnel. So in asking where science fiction should go, we have to be mindful of actually where it's been. And where it's been is basically in the gutter of compromised science fiction that has been propagated to conceal the truth about secret defense projects.
Well, there's a term going around called predictive programming that a lot of sci-fi films will preempt technology that's about to be released so that the public doesn't freak out when it happens.
Mm-hmm.
Do you give any credence to that?
I don't know if you can say it's predictive programming, but I think it's clear that I think that mainstream media is used to both prepare people for certain possible futures. For example, the emergence of a black president in the United States. How many feature films featured an African-American president?
Deep Impact with Morgan Freeman.
Oh, I mean, like 50 major films in the 20 years before Barack Obama was elected in 2008. Featured
24 series with Jack Bauer.
Yeah, a tall, well-spoken African-American president, such as President Obama is.
Oh my God!
And can I just say, real quick, in all those movies, there's always a calamitous catastrophe that's about to occur that the president is presiding over.
Yeah.
Right. If you're going to inoculate the American people to accepting an African-American president, despite the history of slavery and Jim Crow and racial discrimination in the country, you place a black president in the film who ably handles the worst possible kind of catastrophe that a president could confront. So that reduces the fear factor if you're engaging in, predictive programming. So yeah, I think some of it is predictive programming. A lot of it during the several decades after World War II was simply rote propaganda to convince the people that certain things hadn't been achieved or to confuse foreign countries about different devices that the U.S. had already secretly developed, such as Tesla teleportation.
That's a good point, Andrew. Also, I just wanted to say to both you guys while you're on, you guys, not to disparage the astronauts, but you guys really were the unsung heroes of this new pioneering technology that hopefully one day we'll all, reap the benefits of. And this whole time you've had to kind of bite your lips or watch as other people have received accolades, and, you'd have to hear Neil Armstrong say, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, when you guys were, literally teleporting through to Mars and I mean, just beyond, so far beyond what they were doing and how they were lionized, in movies like The Right Stuff. There's only actually 3 movies that come to the top of my head that were positive, dealing with these matters, and it was Contact with Jodie Foster, which was written by Sagan, Close Encounters with Spielberg, and E.T. were the only 3 that had kind of a positive slant. The rest were all sort of cautionary tales like I, Robot and, the things Asimov was writing. And you're absolutely right. It was right after World War II, and that was a reason for that, and you touched on it. And I just wanted to tell you guys that, if this ever does, come our way, you guys should definitely, receive some sort of credit for being the real pioneers that took those brave first steps in the program.
Yeah, definitely. It requires a lot of balls. Can I just get one more question in? Going back to the holographic synthetic quantum environments, could you just go over those again?
Well, essentially, Bernie noted as the investigator for the project, then I'll turn it over to Bernie. Basically, he noted as the investigator of the project that there was clear evidence that sometimes artificial holographic effects were awaiting us when we were on Mars. The first was the night run that we did, I think it was on 3383, because I think I used that as a memory aid. But it was definitely several years into the jump room program after we were trained in 1980, where when we went up, strange effects were occurring, like we were being chased by these dinosaurs around the area several hundred feet in front of the corkscrew, the jump room facility called the corkscrew. But as we did so, we could see that everybody was illuminated where they were running, as if by a spotlight, but there was no source to the spotlight. The ground was just illuminating, as if there was a light under the soil, which makes no sense. There was also the belief of some of the people who had been on that night run that we'd been injured. Like I was convinced that my right arm had been torn off. But then when Regina and I were debriefed by Bernard Mendez and by Major Ed Dames, Bernie had me look at my right arm and actually reach over and touch it to calm down and realize that I hadn't lost my arm. It had only been a holographic effect imposed by who or whatever we had encountered on that jump. Then there was also the holographic effects that I was talking about today on Vinny's show, about the fact that that lady was not part of the program, the one that she was in the jump room facility dropping the name Jesus every other sentence. And she was the one who was calling out to that boy, and that boy was sort of augmented into our team as we were walking along that road, as my father was inspecting the ramparts for Parsons to see if they would protect us from the predators. So that was clearly a holographic effect. So I then invented the term synthetic quantum environment, or SQE. So we're calling the notion that we were just accessing one of these pseudo environments or micro universes in time space, SQE, and then small case Mars. Because presumably if there are 153 of those SQEs, some of them, one of them may be, I don't know, Dodge City, Kansas, maybe Dallas, Texas or something. I'd like to turn it over to Bernie, but basically Bernie detected, and I think he did brilliant scientific work. I mean, Bernie's not trained as either classically or technically as a scientist, except he has credentialing in a number of hard sciences, including geology. But I think if you look at the methodology that Bernard Mendez used to investigate what was going on, it was really a pretty brilliant discovery in science that is worthy of being credited in the same way that I thank you for crediting the fact that we should be recognized for being explorers. I mean, Bernie really detected highly unusual conditions going on and framed an explanation for what we were really encountering that I think was scientifically brilliant. So I'll turn it over to Bernie.
We'll wait the 15 seconds.
Well, I guess I won't, but anyway, so I'll turn it back to Vinny. But yeah.
Well, look at it.
Now,
Shall we say, there's a lot of important topics of our time that are currently going on, and Andy, I believe you're one of the important people of our time in terms of revealing information that really changes the way the world really looks at itself and how it operates in its day-to-day life. I mean, on a par with, say, the man who invented the automobile or the train or the plane. Okay, this is just another new form of teleportation. While you didn't invent it, there's a heck of a lot of people who don't know that it was even invented in the first place, and are completely unaware that it's even capable of being utilized in any fashion whatsoever. The knowledge of its existence in itself changes the world. I mean, without even actually having any effect, instantly changes the world in the way a person looks at it, because suddenly these things that we have grown up with, traveling from A to B, and it's like, no, bro, they're the same place, you just step over. It changes that whole paradigm. It changes your way you perceive time in and of itself, whether it took an hour or instantaneously to get to a different place. It's now a reality based on your first-hand testimony and all the other whistleblowers have come forth since you've broken the ice, as it were. So I concur with what Martin was saying about deserving worthy recognition. And what I would not want to see is perhaps turn into the Howard Hughes or the Tesla who withdraw from society entirely and perhaps, I don't know, either go a little out of their mind from lack of social contact or anything of that. I don't think that's in either of you guys' futures, really. And incidentally, I was just thinking about myself yesterday, as I do think about myself a lot, kind of a bit narcissistic like that. But I was just thinking, you know what I really want to accomplish in life? I want to actually make a lasting effect on the world. You know, I want to make something that happens that'll be remembered and maybe inspire people long after I'm gone. Is there any similarity with that for you guys?
Yeah, the historical figure I relate to is Christopher Columbus. In fact, we now know that when Christopher Columbus sailed west, he encountered about 500 miles west of the Azores a metal statue that was pointing to the New World. So he clearly was not the first. The analogy I'm drawing is the fact that when he left Western Europe and sailed across the Atlantic, he had to outfit his ship and provision it with sailors against the backdrop of a contemporary society that was telling him that they would either sail off the edge of the ocean, the edge of the earth, or encounter huge sea monsters that would devour them. In a similar way, I'm dealing with experiences in my childhood and young adulthood that took place respectively 40 and 30 years ago that indicate that, you know, when I say the time, space, age has begun, that's kind of my catchphrase for my disclosure effort, for my truth campaign. I really should be saying the time, space, age began 40 years ago when Tesla teleportation was reduced to practice by the U.S. defense technical community. So I'm clearly not a physicist. I make no claims of being a scientist. I think I'm a scientist in a general classical sense, like maybe, if not Galileo, then perhaps a prominent journalist would be in terms of trying to tell the truth of what's gone on, what we know has occurred. But we're basically, you know, as Alex Jones has stated, we're basically in an information war. I don't think we necessarily have to view it as a war. Maybe we should think in terms of information peace, you know, that we're going to heal the planet by getting the fullest disclosure of classified information as possible to the people of the world. But I'm in it for the duration, and I'm going to be running for president in 2016 to try to utilize the office of the president to reveal as much as possible that the U.S. government has secretly been involved in, because I just think it's unconscionable that we do otherwise. We need to basically evolve civilization by bringing it into conformance with what groups of human beings have already done and have already achieved.
Bernie, do you have something to add?
No, I really didn't think this would come to light. I didn't think this discussion like this would ever be possible in my lifetime. I was told never to discuss this again. And I'm glad we did discuss it. There's serious implications as to where we're going to be as decisions will be made. You know, we're basically similar countries. We have a democracy, and people should be informed. And when they make decisions to do things, they should be aware of what the risks are. You know, I think we've gone about as far as we're going to go in space. I don't think there's any value to go back to the moon or to Mars. There's nothing really there, but there's this whole group of multi-conglomerates and other groups who want to go there, and well, we don't know what we're liable to have to contend with at some point. Now, it may be a good thing, it may not be a good thing, but, you know, how are we going to determine this if this whole matter isn't opened up and people aren't discussing what's there, and people can't see for themselves what needs to be dealt with? So there are a lot of perplexing questions for sure, but certainly they become slightly more uncomplex when all the information is out there in the public and people give different opinions and different views about things. Go ahead.
Well, I think, I don't know, you have a look at all these people that have discovered certain things throughout the history of man that have changed things, like the guy who discovered germs, Galileo, or people who invented the telescope, or whatever. You know, there's a whole lot of persecution that goes on. And I think there's an old saying. First, I think it might be a Gandhi saying, in fact. It's like, first they ridicule you, then they violently oppose you, and then they accept the truth as self-evident, and you win.
Yeah, there was that saying statement by Mohandas Gandhi, and there was something similar by Schopenhauer that I think has 3 clauses. First they ridicule, then they fight you, then your claim is accepted as self-evident, something like that.
Now, if this is kind of becoming evident, I don't know, how do you see this progressing? Because I don't know about you, but I don't like making predictions. I don't really know what the future will hold. I don't know what I'm going to be capable of doing within a month's time in terms of increase in my workload or whatever. I don't know how things will unfold, but I do know what direction that I'm heading, and I do know what I'm going to be doing every single day in order to accomplish my objective, which is to expose scumbaggery in all its forms, whether that be corporate scumbaggery, government scumbaggery, or military scumbaggery, all the same. As long as these dark things are brought to light, I believe that maybe a balance can be struck. It would be great if people could be free. It'd be great if they could develop things on their own without other people interfering, confiscating their equipment and their experiments and under national security or something like that. I believe that if we simply restore people's basic freedoms and allow people to tinker and tailor or away with whatever they want, suddenly a society of renowned yield and growth, I think, would ensue, because you wouldn't have this bureaucratic, horrific process keeping everybody down and slowing everything up and secreting away those things that could bring everybody up and speed everything up. Seems to be the only objective.
Well,
anything that seems to be beneficial and
there's a way.
frees people from some kind of financial or time or some other form of everyday bondage seems to get suppressed at every turn.
Well, there's a way around this, and the way around it is that we go out into the unknown. We work in the administration to establish liaisons with these aliens, to talk to the liaisons and have dialogue with the liaisons, and to ask permission for us to go out there. They could show us around. I found another way. Now, I think Neil knows about it. I think the Navy knows about it. And there's another way to go about this. We can ask permission, and they could show us around. They can make a ship for us, and they could show us things that we need to see. And as far as technologically speaking, we cannot go to their level. They're too technologically advanced. Back engineering has only been a partial success. But we can train them at our level, train them in our ways, and maybe they can adapt things and make improvements here in our way of life. I think that's the way to go. But this whole multi-conglomerate that you've been bringing up doesn't see it that way, and they run the show. And that's what has to change. That, you know, the whole idea is getting aliens to assess us as we assess ourselves on this question, and for them to work with us to build a better world here. And when whatever world's out there is very ugly, Mars is destroyed, the moon is destroyed, there are destroyed civilizations or parts of civilization who are desperate. What are their needs? What are their wants? Maybe it's something simple that we could do to have better relations with them, rather than go barging into their world and turning it upside down and saying, look, we conquered their world. That's not possible. We don't have the might to do it. But there's another way. And we gotta look into this other way of making change. And, you know, it's gonna happen. That's another reason why I stepped forward. I believe it's inevitable. I don't believe it will be my lifetime. I'm pushing 60. I don't expect to live beyond that. Most people like me pass on about this time, whatever reason they have for us passing on. But whatever the case may be, we have to find a way along those lines. And I think it's basically coming down to how much society or societies are willing to accept of what these space aliens are and what they're telling us and what they want from us and what their needs, their hopes, their desires, their fears are. And I don't think we have properly assessed that, these different groups. We've got all the groups categorized, so to speak, but we don't have liaisons with all the groups. And when their message, although it's not conforming to our belief systems in religion or our belief systems in our government or belief systems in our daily lives, that's something we have to change and we have to adapt to. The galaxy is the galaxy. We can't change it. We have to adapt to it. And if we're to progress, that's what we have to do. We have to adapt to it. Go ahead.
Well, I think...
Yeah. Vinny, if I might add my remarks, I think that, Bernie has kind of scoped the extraterrestrial dimension of this. There's also, obviously, the terrestrial dimension. And essentially, we have a number of interlocking problems. On the level of leadership, we, using Barry really as a foil for my point, we're electing to principal political positions people who are more interested in remaining popular than in achieving the change that he promised in 2008, for example. Getting the same kind of people who run for student body president in school. So we have to redefine what leadership is.
Well, I think the only people who got more change out of Barack Obama were the people who became out of the job and had to start begging for it on the street.
Right. So I think that the fact that he was a participant in the Mars Jump Room program in the early 80s, and if he fails to use his second term to intelligently reveal what he was involved in, then I think that history will not hold him in high regard, because he has the security of his office now, and under the U.S. Constitution, he cannot be elected for a third term. And therefore, I think he's under a moral duty and an historical imperative to use the office of the president to now reveal what he was part of going on over 30 years ago. So we have a crisis of leadership where even insiders who have the current political standing to advance the truth movement beyond what the efforts of non-public officials like myself can achieve, are failing to do so, even when they are secret project insiders. Another example I would cite, again, I'm not picking on Democrats because I'm a Washington Democrat, but Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico was one of the young staff members on Project Pegasus. And in a June 2003 meeting that we had in Chama, New Mexico, under the pretext of visiting an old car show, Governor Richardson and I talked about the fact that he couldn't help me in my disclosure efforts regarding Project Pegasus because it didn't possess political credibility or traction. Now, there's a component of political leadership that involves being believed and being supported. But what these conventional politicians like Governor Richardson and President Obama are not comprehending is that we're living in a new world linked by the internet where the dissemination of information can be done instantaneously and actually reach beyond and achieve public understanding before such information can be discredited by conventional commentators. So we need leadership by people who are avowed supporters of the disclosure of the truth. So I think that there will be other individuals in the truth movement seeking high office, but certainly I'm going to be, and I hope others will join me in that. One of the other prevailing problems, obviously, is the military-industrial complex and its prerogatives, its values. And I think we could expand President Eisenhower's definition to include the military-industrial intelligence, corporate media, congressional complex. It basically involves all of these influential institutions, governmental and otherwise, that tell us what reality is. Because they're not telling us what reality is. They're sequestering information about what the large, what the most powerful countries themselves have achieved in our father's generation, 30, 40 years ago. So there's a crisis of confidence, and I'm finding that as I am caricatured or defamed on mainstream television, nonetheless, I am really profoundly supported by individuals. So the average person really appreciates the truth, and this is what people are clamoring for. It's what they're hungry for. So I'm confident that if we can get truth tellers in office and establish standards of public revelation that are rational, like not revealing information that would present a clear and present danger, not revealing information that would violate an individual's privacy for no reason, etc., that we could enter a truth era in which our publican institutions catch up with reality. But that's the crisis. They talk about a breakaway civilization in terms of, let's say, a cult of scientists who might settle another planet or develop a really evolved program of quantum access, of time travel. I think the actual breakaway civilization we've had is that the conventional authoritative civilization embodied in government has actually broken away from what it itself has achieved. So that, for example, today, are the thought processes of Barack Obama influenced by the emergency or the crisis that's right in front of him? Or does he ever think back to how far out what we were doing in the Mars project was? In other words, what I'm saying is, periodically since World War II, since the Manhattan Project, small teams of very bright people have done remarkable things, whether they were dealing with extraterrestrial-derived technology or terrestrial-derived technology. But those discoveries haven't been integrated in the common culture. So the breakaway civilization is not a small group of people breaking away from the present. It's the fact that the present civilization has broken away from the past and what we did that can be applied now and in the future. So I think it's a crisis of leadership. It's a crisis of civilization involving the dominance of the military-industrial complex. Look at the United States, one of the world's wealthiest countries, arguably the wealthiest country, still with control of 25% of world capital, with the U.S. 50% of world capital.
Who's that typing in the background there? You're kind of wiping Andy's audio out.
That's not me.
Sorry, that's me.
Not sure that.
Yeah, just remember, if you're going to be making any noises really of any kind, whether they be chair squeaking, typing, or whatever, just for the sake of the quality of the audio, it's just respectful to mute your microphone.
So notwithstanding the fact that the U.S. is still in possession of 25% of world capital, the U.S. federal budget dedicates 59% of its expenditures to what's called defense, which increasingly over the last several administrations has been offensive war against innocent populations, including innocent civilian populations. So the third thing that's needed is for the large military powers led by the United States to renounce aggressive warfare, just like they were. Again, here's our separation from the past. The first two principles of the four Nuremberg principles involve the outlawing of aggressive war and conspiracy to prosecute aggressive war. And yet that's what the United States has been doing. So we've had this separation from reality that's involved the breakaway civilization. Yes, a breakaway civilization in which the civilization has broken away from the past and its mandates. That's resulted from political mediocrity. So we have to put quality people in government. They have to be not just well-educated individuals, but courageous individuals, because this is a crisis of leadership. If President Obama fails to disclose his involvement in the jump room program, I think that failure of leadership will be clear because he has nothing more to gain by being popular. He was just elected for his last term. The only office he could conceivably hold, and I don't think it would be given to him, is he would never be made the Pope of Rome because he's not a Roman Catholic and he's an American. He might have a shot at being UN Secretary General, just as it was discussed that Bill Clinton might be. But again, I don't think a former American president would be selected for Secretary General of the UN.
I disagree, Andy. He's already the president of the what's it called, the UN Security Council, which is the countries that all have veto rights, and well, basically they are the UN. All the rest of the other countries are just participants in their own enslavement. Really, they get to have a voice that's heard and ignored.
Oh, I agree. And in fact, I've stated that if I'm elected president, I'm going to ask that the Southern Hemisphere be represented on the Security Council with the addition of Brazil, India, Australia, and South Africa. So I hear what you're saying, and I agree. No, what I meant was, personally and professionally, he has only one additional political goal that he could conceivably achieve, because he can't serve as U.S. president ever again after he leaves office in January 2017. And that is possibly he'd have a shot at being Secretary General of the UN. And I don't think that would be given to a former American president, but who knows? I don't think that'll happen. I think Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, is in line for doing that. According to my friend Jonathan Eisen, he has a gentleman's bet. He bet that when she went out of office here, that she'd wind up working at the UN, and sure enough, she wound up the head of the development program. $9 million salary, $9 billion budget, mostly for UN vaccine programs in Africa, which give all the kids AIDS and stuff like that. You know, loving stuff. And she's just been promoted to the number 2 spot at the UN. So I think, yeah, she'd probably be heading up to the number 1 spot sooner than you can say Fat Sam. Right. So that actually basically tends to establish my major premise, which is he has nothing to lose politically by telling the truth at this point. And I think that this is what we're going to have to demand. And I think that really the power that the people hold that they haven't used enough is basically the power of non-participation. Non-participation in warfare, in taxation, and in political comment. I mean, hopefully, during the second Obama term, whatever we call the next 4 years or so, I hope that that the discreditment of mainstream television becomes commonplace, where the mass public begins to shut off the TV set, because that will go a long way to free us from propaganda. But I think it's possible, and I think it can be achieved by bold, revolutionary, independent government. And I think, again, I don't believe sort of in the great man theory of history, but I would note that something as historically significant as the American Revolution was only participated in by 6% of the colonists. And had it not been for indispensable leaders like Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, Madison, and Jay, and the rest of the founders, and that 6% of the colonists, the hanging of George Washington and Benjamin Franklin would be a brief footnote in British history. So I think it's going to require leadership and followership, but not by that much of the population. I think the cultural creative niche that kind of embodies this discourse now numbers about 60 million people primarily in Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. So as kind of trendsetters of that demographic, presumably with the internet, the cultural creative niche will expand to include a large number of humanity. I mean, at any given time, there's about 1 billion people on the internet. So since the cultural creative demographic encompasses the most provocative questions of our time, I think what's going to happen is a massive political and spiritual awakening that will be fueled by programs like yours. Sharing information like Bernie and I have been sharing today. I'm hopeful that the internet and the information revolution is going to disseminate the truth about what the last several generations of humans have achieved on our planet and what we could do with the future.
Well, it's interesting that you should It's interesting that you should mention burning, because I was in fact thinking about this the other day. I'm not a person who's starting the fires. I'm simply the one pouring gasoline on them.
Right.
You know,
I mean, the
That's
fires are
interesting.
there. I wasn't the first American. Well, I was the first American to teleport. I wasn't the first kid to teleport. There were about 20 Latin American kids. I'm expecting at some lecture for one of those kids who inevitably would have been adopted into an American household as an orphan from Latin America to come up and say, you know, I was one of those kids. I know exactly what you're talking about. You know, I was a poor orphan on the streets of Mexico City or Rio or Maracaibo, and these American people interacted with government officials, and I was, you know, adopted into a home in Santa Fe, and I was involved in all this time-space stuff you're talking about. You know, I think what we need now is not to be the first, but we need to focus on being consistent. In other words, we need to sustain the truth. You know, it's not about who did what, when, and all. That's why I like so much interacting with Bernie and Brett and everything, and the three of us who already come forward on the Jump Room program, because everybody matters and everybody plays a role in human history. The question is, who are going to be the drum majors that are going to keep humanity focused on the truth? You know, that's not about being first. That's just a matter about being consistent. So that's what I'm trying to focus on is not telling an exciting story so much as trying to emphasize what's in it for us in terms of, you know, sustaining the fight to tell the truth about these hidden technologies so we can bring them forward and use them to advantage humanity.
It's a long, protracted process, isn't it? Because you can't just come in and slash Adolf Hitler's throat with this one. It's kind of like a brutal guerrilla campaign to put it bluntly. Use the enemy airwaves where you can. Try and hit back at critical targets as often as you can, targets of opportunity, things like that. Have there ever been items in the news that you kind of would have been able to lend comment to, or things like that, Andrew?
Yes, in fact, in 2006, the NBC Nightly News, one of the major network news programs in the United States, aired a news feature piece on teleportation that confused the audience about quantum teleportation versus vortal teleportation. Again, you know, basically reified the Star Trek view of teleportation, involving the use.
Bernie, you're still moving around back there, man.
Reified the Star Trek view of vortal teleportation, involving disintegrating and reintegrating the teleport, in my view, to conceal. In my view, to conceal the vortal teleportation that had already emerged. Now that was 2006. That was already, 36 years.
Jesus, Bernie.
I'm trying to unmute. It won't unmute. It won't mute. It just won't mute.
Right.
And then when I get it to mute, it just doesn't unmute.
Well,
It took 5 minutes to unmute the last time.
It is, as they say, a moot point.
So yes, that broadcast basically reified the fallacious view of teleportation that Star Trek was used to propound, and it featured none other than William Shatner joking that when quantum teleportation emerged, like these brave pioneers in Austria who were talking about it, actually that's when the spiritual teleportation study was supposedly leaked. That was the focus of it. Actually, I correct myself. It was the spiritual teleportation story that was leaked at that time, which was basically just a knockoff from the 1989 revelation of the remote viewing program. Both programs being stated that both had cost $20 million in federal funding. But anyway, going into 2006, we still had an NBC Nightly News basically kill piece on the truth about teleportation. I also just got creamed this year appearing on different mainstream TV shows where the emphasis was either that I was crazy or a liar or had a corrupt character.
Or gay.
Or was gay, or was the gay lover of the President of the United States, which is kind of silly, given the fact that I'm an avowed heterosexual for starters. But so essentially, virtually everything that's been done on mainstream television news about these secret technologies has been absolute disinformation. That's the world we're living in, one in which television news and news feature documentary type reporting can only be relied on to give the government's position and the military's position and the federal or official scientific establishment's position and the corporate position. The actual heuristic truth of what our civilization has done is not discussed on mainstream television. And that's one of the greatest impediments that we're confronting.
Seen any episodes of the television series known as Fringe?
Fringe is partly based on my own work. I wrote up a 50-page single-spaced synopsis of my experiences, replete with references to my discoveries of what I found during my investigation of my experiences in Project Pegasus. It was considered by ABC, Disney, and the WB in the first 6 months of 2008, and there were two outcomes. My 1981 naval portrait was dropped in at 14 minutes and 40 seconds into the Disney animated feature movie called Wall-E. I'll just wait for Bernie to stop making noise.
Wall-E?
And then...
I've got Wall-E on DVD. I'm going to look for that. Well, hold on a second. At what second and minute was it at?
14 minutes and 14 seconds. There's my naval portrait from 1981 is sitting there.
Anything special about the number 14?
No, it's just a scene in the film where they either used the photograph or created the gel cell as animators by overlaying the portrait that Courtney Hunt instructed me to take at the Long Beach Naval Station in fall of 1981 after I had jumped to Mars twice via jump room and would be doing a lot more in 81 and 82. So they had to, I guess, basically dead file me. What's that called? Sheep dipping. They needed a Navy portrait of me in the event that something happened and they had to claim that I was working for the Navy. So I took an unofficial official portrait in a naval uniform and
Bernie, what is that, man? Come on.
It's a brilliant counterintelligence ploy, I think. No. The other thing that happened as a result of trying to bring my story to mainstream television is that certain facts, scenarios depicted in my account were used to make it finish.
Bernie, now we're getting some feedback from you. Got more of a feedback than McDonald's.
So, this is the irony of my career direction thus far, Vinny, is that I'm being asked the question, what about Fringe? And I'm having to tell the truth, which is I partly inspired it because they stole my work. So,
Hey, I see that happening all the time. Science, Hollywood, music, politics. Everybody's always stealing each other's ideas.
Right, but let's throw Leonard Nimoy in because Andy's going to be talking in the next several years about Star Trek being disinformation. So let's start talking about this teleporter and chronovisor stuff. Let's not use his name and his father's name. Let's have Walter Bishop and his son Peter, not Andrew, not his brother Andrew, holding hands while they jump through the teleporter. Let's have Leonard Nimoy talking about Chronovich and Phil Shatner talking about teleportation because we really have to put a lid on this truth campaign that Andy's waging. So anyway, I'm not saying that Fringe isn't a brilliant production or that I inspired all of it. All I'm saying is they've been cribbing inspiration for their episodes from that treatment that I provided to DC Disney and to the WB back in 2008. How it got into their show from there, I don't know.
Yeah, probably some dude sitting around, doing cocaine off some kind of Hollywood prostitute's kind of hip bone, just going, "Hey man, this dude wrote a really awesome story and it's true, but we can't say it as a true story. Have you got any projects coming up where you're gonna disinform people about huge quantities of fringe research that really changes our reality and makes the world a better place?" Yeah. Actually, we've got this one coming up called Fringe. Give us a look at that document, bro.
Yeah. So anyway,
that's exactly how it went down.
Let's not have the kid let's not have the kid lose his feet when he teleports to Santa Fe. Let's have him be cut in half. Let's not have Raymond Basiago hold the hand of his son Andrew as he brings Andy into the time space program. Let's have Walter Bishop, similar last name, hold Peter's hand, etc. So, let's not talk about Ernetti and Gemelli. Let's segue the chronovisor information into Star Trek in a weird way. But anyway, basically, mainstream television is disinformation, and we really have to popularize that idea. It's disinformation per se. And by that I mean it's disinformation with government consultation and involvement in the scripting of these mainstream TV news shows and dramatic presentations.
Also,
go ahead.
Andy, there were two movies where they tried to put people off of, where they put into the subplot where it was overshadowed, the teleportation in The Fly. That was about the guy was such terrible motion sickness that he created the two teleporting pods and became a horrific fly, and it totally overshadowed what he was doing in the first place. And then the other movie that a lot of people missed in this movie is The Prestige, which was done by Christopher Nolan about two dueling magicians. But actually what it's really about is, in the subplot, is about the two dueling scientists, Tesla and Edison. And they're the real two magicians that are dueling in the movie. But, they kind of put their story in the background, and what Tesla does in the movie, played by David Bowie, is he creates a machine for the magicians' rivalry that actually, because the trick they're trying to do is called the teleporting man, and what he's trying to do is he's trying to figure out how the other magician, played by Christian Bale, Hugh Jackman, is trying to figure out how he does his teleporting man trick. So he asks Tesla to create an actual teleportation machine. And he says, once I do this, are you sure you want it, made? And at the end, the whole thing is about destroying it because, of its dangerous implications. And, without trying to spoil the movie for anybody, but if they go back, I think Christopher Nolan was trying to put that in. And that's what the real story was about. And the same with they turned it into a horror movie, but both movies were really about teleportation.
Right. Some of this gets inspired just by, think pieces about what the future may hold, and a lot of it's been really creative. But some of it has clearly involved the government working with film studios and TV networks and with individual science fiction writers to spin the information to conceal the truth from the public. So we have to be more intelligent consumers of mass media.
I think the terms intelligence and consumer are mutually exclusive.
Well, not if the culture creative niche expands. I concur. But if the cultural creative niche becomes the dominant culture, which I guess the mediocrity of internet content would probably work against. But nonetheless, I think they're going to be more and more aware people because, for one thing, there's an explosion in a quest to understand reality among young people. It's obvious if you just basically are a denizen of the internet, that the youth niche, whatever, the demographic youth, the demographic niche defined as youth is like hugely desirous to know what reality holds and what the truth is. They know they've been lied to by several generations of their parents. So I'm still hoping. Your point is well taken.
Well, and there's another area to my point. Can we get to a post-consumer culture where people are more creators than consumers, creators and traders? You know, they're not all completely dependent on other people. I mean, for the most part, they're self-sufficient, but when they need something, they're more than capable of doing a service for that other person that they need.
Well, there's actually something in political science that I think is responsive to your point, which is if you go back to the mid-'90s when the internet emerged, could we address that fan sound?
Yeah, Bernie, you're really going to have to just keep your mic muted, and if you have something to say, just type it down into the Skype chat here, and I'll spot it, and then just go, okay, Bernie, now's your time, because in the meantime there's this fan in the background, the chair moving, scraping, this kind of thing. It's really kind of throwing off the recording.
The fan is on the laptop, and
yeah, most of my fans are online too. So Andy.
Yeah, so if you go back to, let's say, 1995, 96, the time of the emergence of the internet, political scientists, at least, let's say, liberal and progressive political scientists at major universities, were predicting what they called the subsidiarity effect, and kind of in an extension of the notions of participatory democracy of the 1970s and 80s, you know, the call for participatory democracy, for example, that the left was making during those decades when, you know, government was actually going in the opposite direction of participatory democracy into basically corporate enslavement and denial of the truth, suppression of the truth, active suppression of the truth. They were predicting this, what they called the subsidiarity effect in government, which was the idea that government would descend to the lowest level of social organization where it could still be communally effective. And that obviously harmonized with...
With respect, I believe that government is the lowest form of social organization.
I know, and we definitely have to start a comedy team, Vinny, because I set you up very well. But, so you know, yes, I agree that government is the lowest level of social organization, but no, let's presume for the sake of this discussion that it's not. Their point was that, you know, was certainly in harmony with the call for less government and for less public expenditure in government by, you know, anarchists and libertarians and conservatives. Okay, now that didn't happen. You know, we don't have localities in the United States, for example, managing previously federal wildlife reserves in their region or biome. Okay, we don't have the states paying for food stamps, or the localities paying for food stamps, or providing food to hungry people directly. In most of the major countries, at least, there was no subsidiarity effect where government redounded to the lowest level of organization, where it could still be effective. But something like subsidiary internet has been long, or at least mediocre, from either an academic or a journalistic perspective. So I would argue that, for example, possessing a Facebook account or a modem or a personal computer doesn't make somebody a journalist. Okay, training and experience as a journalist and achieving a journalistic level of reporting makes somebody a journalist. So we've got a more plebeian discourse going on with more people people getting, for example, and with an overlay of belief, whether it be a conspiratorial belief or otherwise. So I don't really know where I was going with this, except to say that we are living in a new world in the sense that I can write something about time travel or show an image of something that I have found in NASA's images that show life on Mars and put it on one of my websites, and right away somebody in Africa or in Australia or New Zealand or some other distant land from where I am in Washington State in the United States can immediately see what I have found or what I'm writing. And that's huge. Those billion people online, that's just a total quantum shift in the nature of the polity. So I think there's going to be more public demand for authenticity in government. I think Barack Obama's emergence was based on a belief, particularly among young people, that he was a catalytic or revolutionary historical figure. And while he hasn't proven to be, I think at least that showed that's possible now. So like I said, I'm guardedly optimistic, but I do think that we have had subsidiary of information. And the paradox of that is if you disseminate previously restricted information at the lower levels of social organization, it tends to trickle up to higher levels of social organization. So for example, my first lecture was to a group of 40 people. My largest lecture has been to a group of 1,250 people, live, in person. My smallest radio broadcast was a podcast that was attended by 129 people. But we know that Coast to Coast gets 29 million listeners per segment. So you can utilize the subsidiarity effect in media to basically begin small and build to where ultimately a large audience is receiving your information. And that's a good thing, if the messages are salutary. The danger of an interlocked world like that, an internet-connected world, is that complete nonsense can get disseminated quickly as well. And I think we see that in the 2012 phenomenon, the idea that we're going to have a catastrophe on December 21st. I don't think we are. I think it's just a belief.
I don't know about you, Andy, but I'm definitely going to have a catastrophe on the 21st. I'm inviting a whole bunch of people around here. There will be alcohol.
Yeah, excluding your beer consumption on the 21st.
I'm going to have a 21st yard glass.
So, and I think that that's going to inevitably foment a demand for greater openness from government. So that's the ground laid out, and that's where it's going. It's going into a set of individuals who are going to be ratcheting up public focus on what we haven't been told. That's the missing component in our culture.
Well, many missing components to our culture, I say. How a lot of people will sit around and they'll discuss the problems of the world as if they're big enough to solve them. I think one person is big enough to change the world, but not big enough to solve the problems of the world. It takes a lot more people involved in this, and not just people who are sitting back and listening and are being aware of it, but those people who, in fact, get involved, those people who volunteer, submit evidence support of some description, propagation of the message, in any form of action, no matter how large or small. I think the cumulative effect of many people doing a lot of small things really adds up to a lot. I think David Icke calls that the totalitarian tiptoe. So it can work both ways.
Right, but see, as long as the internet stays up and we can have citizen reporting and we can have individuals do relatively small broadcasts in terms of their initial magnitude but be YouTube, that will constantly be a check against informational fascism by centralized authorities in society, the government, corporations, the military, etc. I hope. Sadly,
YouTube is also the kind of central video platform for the web, really. It's number 1 or number 2, I think, on the Alexa.com global rankings. And there have been many documented cases of messing around with people's counters and things of that nature. I've got screenshots on this very computer that I took myself of Alex Jones videos that have 15 views and 6,000 favourites. As in, people have favorited that video 6,000 times, but only 15 people have seen it. You know, just, that doesn't make sense. Unless, of course, you think about the information that's being suppressed and the lack of interest there will be inherent in a video that virtually nobody's seen. Because popularity is kind of like, once you're popular, you get more popular, rather than once you've put something up and it's got no video, no hits or anything like that. You know what I'm saying? But yes, it is one small doorstop towards these big marching hallowed doors of a new world order that are being opened up on us. Now, we've been going for nearly 3 hours. My girlfriend has been on her way home pretty soon. I think I have to rustle her up tea. So if we have any final statements and things like that, we have a new person who's just joined the chat there. Alan? Alan, are you there?
Yep.
Do you have any quick questions for Andrew Basiago or Bernie Mendez?
No, I'm a big fan of his, and I'm glad that I heard a little bit of the end.
Okay. Well, this has all been recorded as well for posterity's sake, and it will be uploaded to the Vinnie Eastwood Show .com commercial-free archive section. I'll just pop the link down here for you all. Okay. Well, in that case, Bernie, it might be about time to unmute your microphone for your final statements. And while we're waiting for the 5 minutes for the microphone to unmute, we'll give Andy a chance for his final statements. I guess there aren't any.
Vinny, if I could jump in then and just fire away with some of my final points. I'm going to sustain my campaign. I think I would just like to note, without really summing up, I would just like to note that just for the good of the order, presumably I'm going to survive and reach the presidency or whatever my future holds, but it's going to be fun. But the only thing I really want to note, I don't think we talked about, is the fact that I wish Bernie was still on so he could corroborate this, but basically the woman that Bernie and I jumped with Regina Dugan, that we call the night run, where there were the weird optical effects and then the mysterious holographic effects where I thought my arm had been ripped off by one of the creatures. We know who that woman is, and without revealing her identity, because we want to extend to her the courtesy of being approached by us before we ask her to come forward as a fellow whistleblower, just so that she doesn't discover that there are people out in the internet land or out in the public making claims about her before these claims have been vetted with her. But one of the items that's on the agenda for 2013 is to contact that woman. And I can say that while she's not as prominent an American woman, let's say, as Hillary Clinton, she is a publicly known personality of substantial reputation. She's not a celebrity. She's been the director of a significant organization of a pro-social nature. And I'm not playing, guess who it is. I'm just saying that this person is at least as credible as any of the people that I've brought forward thus far, in the sense that she has an existing public reputation for directing a major institution of a pro-social nature in a admirable way. So we have somebody here who's carrying some of the public freight of a Barack Obama or a Regina Dugan, but who we think that we can turn and have her come forward and reveal that she was a participant in the Jump Room program. So that's one of the reasons I'm so optimistic. So I just wanted to note the existence of that whistleblower. Of course, I still have to approach formally the president and Regina Dugan, the former director of DARPA, about their willingness or unwillingness to come forward and acknowledge their participation in the Jump Room program and the existence of the project itself. But if Mr. Obama and Ms. Dugan decide not to do that, we still have another source that we've developed. We know who she is. We know where she lives. We have her telephone number. We have a liaison to her that we can rely on to set up a meeting if she would agree for me to fly in and meet with her at her home or locally. So I'm very optimistic that the jump room program will be further corroborated in 2013 if we're successful in when we reach out to this individual in the sense that she decides to come forward and help us tell the story of the jump room program, which essentially proves the existence of time travel because it was non-linear travel in time space, whatever it was, whether it was teleportation or chronovision. And I'm emphasizing that because, as I said during the broadcast, it's much easier to prove the jump room program because it was more recent. In the case of Project Pegasus, most of the participants are deceased or quite elderly. But anyway, I'm very hopeful, and this is a very remarkable individual in the same way that Regina Dugan is as a distinguished American woman. She's really a very positive and accomplished person who has had a positive impact on the world. She was about Bernie's age when we were jumping with her. And I remember asking her name first and last, so I know that we've identified the right person. And Bernie has corroborated the involvement of this individual and remembering her surname and everything. So that's one of the things that 2013 will hold if we can, when we reach out to this woman, whether she'll agree to come forward.
Well, that's exciting stuff. You seem to be accumulating like a kind of I don't know, like a Dirty Dozen-esque type chrononaut panel. It'd be interesting to do a conference with the whole lot of you. How about that? The chrononaut conference.
And it was an eclectic group of people. We haven't ruled out the possibility. I mean, it was an eclectic group of jumpers, but also a group of jumpers that maybe just as an afterthought. In fact, I can describe what Bernie identified as some of the characteristics of the jumpers. That apparently we were selected for high intelligence, for non-competitiveness. Bernie mentioned the idea they didn't want a jumper who would, run up the hill and then brag about it. They wanted people to be more cohesive as team members, more type B personalities, maybe a little grandiosity in their personality so they could withstand the psychological forces of going to another planet.
Maybe they wanted you like that so that you didn't, I don't know, maybe jump down a slide and get eaten by a dinosaur?
Yeah, to include. So what distinguishes the group, though, is that there were fairly remarkable professional outcomes among most of the participants. So one theory we have is they actually were using chronovision to identify future American leaders and then work with them in real time and include them in the jump room program for whatever reason they did that. For example, maybe to harmonize relations between Earth and Mars, so they were actually selecting members of the future leadership community, and therefore we're dropping them into the jump room experience. I don't know, but for the 10 people we started with, and when we factor in this lady, it looks like there's some colorable possibility that they were actually working forward in time to identify us in the future and then involve us in the program. But suffice it to say that this woman is not a government official, but she has had a remarkable career working to extend the positive impact of a pro-social organization. So she possesses high credibility as a witness participant. So we're eager to bring her forward publicly, and that may very well happen in 2013. I think if it happens at all, it'll happen this coming year.
Well, that'll be cool.
Yeah. Very nice person. She was back then. But I remember she was on the night run with us when we were in that military barracks that Bernie has described. I asked her name. I questioned her about her name. And so it's a positive ID. We're also interested in exploring any issues of whether she forgot what happened, had it repressed through brainwashing, doesn't want to revisit it personally or publicly, and that whole dynamic. That's why we don't want to reveal who it is before we reach out to her. But we're going to try to, get her on the truth train, and this story will have even more believability because of the prominence of this person in terms of what her leadership role in society has been and how successful she's been.
Okay. Now, do we have Bernie in the background there now? Bernie, are you there? Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Go. Gotcha.
Can you hear me now?
Roger.
Okay. I don't know where this is all going. This has all got to be assessed. The internet has not been completely assessed. I spoke to a senator or two. They have 5 groups working on assessing the internet and what it's all going to mean. It may change everything. It may change foreign policy and positions on policy, because a lot of the foreign governments, like Iran, Iraq, and all that Middle East situation, third world, and they're going to get the internet, would be able to communicate a little more, and then because they live in closed societies at one time. I should have kept that magazine I had from Time magazine when I was over in Saud, and from the 70s. And if you looked at it, it just had pictures and had little sayings about what was going on with the leader and President Carter meeting with their leaders, but it didn't say much. It didn't have any advertisements in it. And I said, well, why are you like this? Why don't you, just read regular Time magazine? Because they felt that, this would have an effect on their society, and that people would get very disturbed about it. So as this internet evolves and its effect on the third world, in the Middle East, it's going to affect our lives, because whatever is going on over there affects our lives to a great deal. And this whole ET question is going to be opened up. And Andrew just may make president. I'll tell you that right now, because if he gains in popularity to a point, that's a lot of votes. And people are going to say, well, we want to know more, and we think you have good ideas, and maybe this will work. Hey, you never know. Go ahead.
Right, well, I think that kind of wraps it up for today. I think in total that's nearly 5 hours of direct witness testimony without a single juror falling asleep. How about them apples? I do like
Excellent.
that. Okay, gentlemen, Andy, thank you very
Amazing.
much. ProjectPegasus.net is Andrew Basiago's website if anybody would like to check out any of his other content. And Bernard Mendez is from UFOQ&A.com, as well as BernardMendez.com. Guys, thank you very much.
Thank you, Benny. Have a good night.
It's been a privilege.
All right. Good night, everybody.
See you in the future.